Bill Clinton's line where he says, when you're in a hole, the last thing you want to do is keep digging.
Yeah, right. Just get out of it.
And there's our Senator Pro Tem chewing away.
I know you think I'm always eating. It just happens that my eeating schedule coincides with my work. Right. What can I do?
Oh, I love it. I love it.
And Senate Economic Development makes her hungry.
I love the way you chew and sway too at the same time.
I know, I never knew I did that until this whole Zoom thing. And I was like, I make people a little dizzy with my swaying. So my apologies.
Yes, but inspired by you, I have ordered a thing that moves up and down so I can stand because, oh, thank you.
So let's go live, Nathan, or we already are. Okay.
Thank you.
So we're going to start off this morning dealing with S34, which is a repeat of a bill that came out of our committee last year, trying to establish a second housing bond and also doing other miscellaneous things. And then after 45 minutes or so, we're going to move into a housing roundtable discussion for like an hour and 20 minutes. I'm aware of the uphill battle on a second housing bond, and this was put in before the governor's speech yesterday, where he alluded to the fact that he had talked about the success of the first bond, and then he said, but instead of doing bonding, let's just pay for it, some of it now, by putting $20 million more into Vhcb. One of the things I want to accomplish is to understand how he makes that equation. Obviously, that's very welcome news and is a great down payment, but I don't think it's anywhere near what a bond would produce if we had the wherewithal to produce a bond. So I'm going to ask people like Maura and others to give us some ideas as to if there, and I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it because it's, as I say, it's an uphill thing, but I just want to keep our thinking caps on when we get an offer potentially of that kind of significant money, how we can leverage even more money or parlay that into more housing. So let's start off with Becky, if you could just walk us through, and because of the framing I'm putting on this, we can do it fairly briefly. Let's not get caught up in the weeds here, but just the general approach that was being put forth in this bill, which I think several members of this committee co-sponsored with me, and I thank you for that.
Sure. Oh, I see. I am a co-host now. Okay, I will bring it up on my screen. Okay.
And it's on our website, right? So we can all just pull it up.
It is. And do you also see it on the screen now?
Yep. It's just tiny.
Could you just make it, just a little bit bigger, Becky?
Sure.
Thanks.
Okay. I think if I... Is that okay, or is that too big? Is that...
It's good.
That works?
That's
okay.
good. That's better.
Okay, great. So Becky Wasserman, Legislative Counsel. This is S34, which is an act relating to funding affordable housing. As the chair just mentioned, this is essentially rerunning a bill from last year to create a second housing bond that would be issued by VHFA and to be used by the Vhcb to support more affordable housing. I'll highlight some changes just from last year as I go along, but the first section of this bill is the sort of intent, findings, intent, and purpose. So in the findings, there's language which was similar to last year, that there was this Housing for All revenue bond that was issued in 2017 to support the development of affordable housing throughout the state. And what's updated is at the top of page 2 is what that bond generated. So the results of that bond are generating a total of $37 million in bond proceeds, that Vhcb used to fund the creation and improvement of 843 homes across the state, leveraging 200 million in other resources. So I think just compared to last year, the funding was able to be used over the past year in addition to what was reported last year. Subdivision 3 talks about a continuing need for housing, particularly a housing shortage in light of COVID-19. There's an increase in the incidence of homelessness, as well as the difficulty in finding a home, even for individuals and families with financial support for rent. And subdivision 4 finds that additional investments are needed to create these affordable housing options for Vermonters. And it has the same goals stated as last year to reverse demographic trends, contributing to a more inclusive and equitable state and supporting growth based on existing infrastructure and settlement patterns. The purpose of the bill is to develop and improve affordable housing for current and future state residents. And then finally, the intent in subdivision 2 at the top of page 3 is to authorize VHFA to issue a new bond, and this can be a single bond or a series of bonds between FY23 and FY28, and then transfer those proceeds to Vhcb to support this development of additional affordable housing. The next few sections are sort of the substance of creating the authority for both Vhcb to use this funding and for VHFA to issue the bonds. So section 2 is relating to Vhcb's, it's creating a new section to allow them to use the bonds for this the second bond to fund housing that meets community needs. And there's some language in there about funding the creation and improvement of owner-occupied and rental housing for Vermonters with very low to middle income, up to 120% of the area median in areas targeted for growth and reinvestment. And there's some priorities set forth in this section, which are to create a new multifamily and single family homes, address blighted properties and other existing housing stock that require reinvestment, and this includes mobile home parks. And then finally, at the top of page 4, the last priority is to provide service-supported housing in coordination with AHS. And this includes those who are elderly, homeless, in recovery, experiencing severe mental illness, or leaving incarceration. Section 3 is in statute, and it's the Vhcb annual report requirement. So this section is just saying that in addition to the reporting that Vhcb has to do, on lines 12 through 14, it says, in addition to that, that report has to include the list of projects funded from this second bond. Section, and I'll just pause if anyone has any questions. Nope. I don't see any.
Bless you.
Section 4 is the section of law that deals with the property transfer tax. So this bond, the idea is that it would be supported by property transfer tax revenues. This section of law sets out how those property transfer tax revenues are distributed. And I'm just scrolling down here. For some context, there's already in statute ways that this tax revenue should be used. It is, I think, as you all know, it's not followed every year, but there is 50% that should go to the Vermont Housing Conservation Trust Fund, 17% to the Municipal and Regional Planning Fund, and 33% to the general fund. And then before all that happens, 2% goes to the Department of Taxes for property valuation and review, a special fund. So what happened with the first housing bond, as you'll see on lines sort of 12 through 19, is that language was added here that says before you distribute any of those property tax transfer tax revenues as set out in statute, 2.5 million will go to pay for the principal and interest of that first Housing for All revenue bond. So what this bill is doing is moving to page 6. It's saying sort of in addition to that, before you distribute all of those other ways that the statute sets out for the property transfer tax revenue, and in addition to that 2.5 million that's going to the first bond, this is setting aside 4 million of that revenue received to be transferred to VHFA to pay the principal of an interest due on those bonds, on this second bond. Are there any questions on that?
Is that number just higher because the bond proceeds are $50 million now, or the interest rates have changed, or what?
I just used the number from last year's bill. I think it was because it was a higher bond amount, but
Yeah.
so I don't know if this still sort of corresponds this year to what is the correct amount, but this was what was put in place in last year's bill.
Okay.
And then subsection F here is saying that while both bonds are outstanding, the rate of tax on the property transfer tax can't be reduced below a certain amount that produces $30 million in subdivision 1 in the instance when both bonds are outstanding, and at least 18 million when the second bond is outstanding. And I believe the first bond is set to end in 2039, and this bond would be 2043.
Can we pause there and have some questions? So
Absolutely.
how much do we usually get annually in revenue from the property transfer tax?
That's a great question. I have to check with the joint fiscal office, and I think it changes every year, and I don't know what
Jen
the average.
might,
Jen
Jen
Holland
might know.
could probably answer that.
Yeah, Jen will know.
Good morning, everyone. Jen Holland with the Vermont Housing and Conservation Board. So it's been running about 38 to 45 million over the last couple of years. That's the entire amount to the state. And of course, it goes to different purposes. As a result of the recent surge in home sales and prices, the forecast is now that FY21 will be up to about 54 million, and the forecast for FY22 is 68 million.
Whoa.
Thanks.
That's right.
But was I reading it incorrect? These are one-time amounts in that section of the bill, or they're annual amounts? Because it's such a volatile tax that I just feel like it's committing a lot of money that we may not have if it's annual, but I'm confused.
Yeah, that is annual. So that's saying so that is sort of suggesting that you have to have the tax rate you can set the tax rate at an amount that will produce at least that amount every year for the next 20 years while these bonds are outstanding.
Okay.
So the general thinking here that I certainly subscribe to is that in the last bond, we were giving, we're taking away from Vhcb, Jen, you could correct me, I can't remember if it was $1.5 million a year of their annual appropriation to help pay for the debt service of this $37 million bond over 20 years. So instead of giving, I'm simplifying this greatly, but instead of giving Vhcb an extra $1.5 million each year to produce $1.5 million worth of housing, they were getting 37 million right up front and can produce a multitude of housing now and lose that 1.5 million every year for 20 years, where they would be hopefully building housing over the 20 years, but it would coming out much, much slower. In addition, that 37 million wound up to produce 250 million of construction of housing in the first couple of years of the bond. So in my mind, it's sort of like if we were developing a community, part of Burlington, we were building like 100 houses, and we had a certain amount of money, we can only build a fraction of those houses right now if we had to pay 100% of the cost of the housing immediately. But everybody takes out mortgages and they only pay 5% now. So you build 20 times as many houses right now as opposed to waiting by spending the money. So we're basically trying to leverage funds. And the problem we faced is rating agencies say there's too much borrowing in the state of Vermont. So this idea, while creative, potentially makes Vermont a higher risk in terms of defaulting. So what I would hope to do, and I wouldn't at this point, we're not going to spend a lot of time on this bill, but I'd like to hear from Jen and Maura, unless people have further questions or Becky has more to say. From Jen and Maura, just briefly, the success of the last bond, some metrics, and is there other ideas out there now that the $20 million extra that's going to Vhcb is not a done deal. We haven't gotten into all the needs and how that money is going to be used, but it's a huge amount of money that I'm very happy to see. But how can we leverage that into more money so we can build more housing now and not necessarily wait for it to trickle out over the years ahead?
And Michael, may I just add to that? I guess one question is, Becky, are you done? Was there anything else you wanted to highlight before?
I think that the rest of the language is just the sort of statutory authority relating to VHFA being able to issue the bonds. I think I would just highlight, just to go through it quickly, is that Section 7 is saying in this fiscal year, at least $4 million would be set aside for this purpose from those revenues. And then Section 8 of the bill repeals all of these authorities in 2043 when the bond matures. So that's the quick summary, and I can stop the share now.
Great, thanks.
Thank you, Becky.
Thanks.
Okay, so let's move on.
And Michael, my question for you was, it was exciting to hear about the 20 million. There's no question, but gosh, that's day one of this process, and there's going to be a lot of vying for that one-time money, and it's a top priority of ours, but there's a lot of other one-time money priorities. Whether we end up at 20 million, I think we, as you wisely, I think, say, we it's great, but let's keep moving in. I think we should keep all the burners going, because who knows where we'll end up with that proposal.
Correct. And if we can get some multiplier effect, maybe we can kill two birds with one stone, or solve some of the other one-time needs, and not in any way reduce the amount of housing projected to be built with that $20 million. So, Senator Brock, you're muted.
Randy, we can't hear you.
Can you just refresh our memory, Becky, on the definition of affordable housing? I believe the one that I see is in the chapter in Title 32 regarding tax credit, charitable investments in housing, but there may be other definitions somewhere. This one essentially says that Vhcb shall adopt a rule in which the definition and it meets certain tests. But is there any other definition of affordable housing in statute?
I think there is. I would have to find it, and I guess I would also point to the fact that this bill specifically says that the creation of funding is for owner occupied and rental housing for Vermonters with very low to middle income, up to 100% of the area median in areas targeted for growth and investment. But there's another statutory section, and I can, unless maybe more or Jen know that offhand, I can find it for you quickly.
Yeah, I'm Senator Brock, I'm sure Maura can, or Jen can tell us at least for the purpose of introduction of this bill, we were trying to replicate the standards of who this housing would be built for that was in the first bond, and they could tell us what the criteria was. Okay, so let's move on to Maura.
Mr. Chair,
Yes, I'm sorry, Senator Rahm, I did see
I think
you.
my hand's like going
Yep.
against background. But when Jen and Maura are sharing, I just love to hear sort of a philosophical thinking around the mix. And I know with the rental assistance, it mostly probably has to go to rental housing, but the sort of mix of home ownership and rental housing that we're thinking about, because it just feels really disproportionate. We know it is disproportionate in the state who stays in a cycle of rental housing, and who faces barriers to accessing home ownership. And I just want to see more focus on home ownership.
You want to see more focus on home ownership rather than rental? Is that what you're saying?
Yes.
Okay.
And
Senator Clarkson.
just as we've discussed that at length, and we're also wanting to focus on the asset gap too at a later point. But we push home ownership in this state big time, and there is definitely been more. There is a major need for rental housing too, and it's not just for all people. I mean, there is so. And home ownership obviously represents a huge asset for many. I think as we look at those questions, I'd also love to look at our home ownership mix of our income brackets, because I think Randy's getting at this. We need more housing in all areas, and the cost of housing is such a barrier to any housing being built. And I would love to see us also sort of expand the range of what we're looking at. And as Jen and Maura start their testimony, I'd love to hear sort of also what some of the lessons learned are from the last bond, and how we can improve this work as we go forward. Because it was great, but it wasn't. There's always things to improve.
Okay, so Maura, would you mind starting out and just give a brief history of your feelings about the last bond and what it accomplished, and then go into the I guess the larger question of if you see anything in your world that we should explore, given this fact that I think we're going to have significant monies to put towards housing. Certainly would be wonderful if just the $20 million survived for Vhcb, but it would be nice to see if we can even do better somehow in producing housing stock.
Can do that, and I can be quite brief to leave time for Jen, because I think a lot of your questions are really on what Vhcb accomplished with the last bond. So my name is Maura Collins. I'm the director of Vermont Housing Finance Agency. VHFA's role in the last housing bond was to issue the bond, because that is what we do, and then turn the proceeds over to Vhcb, who then deployed it, which is why I'd like to leave, I hope it's okay with Jen, but the majority of the time to Jen, because a lot of the discussion you're talking about was on the outcomes of the last bond, because it sounds like you want to replicate some of the great work in the future. To speak to a couple of the questions that I've heard so far, Senator Sorokin, the numbers that you were talking with Becky about of the $4 million of PTT and such are based on the fact that it's now a $50 million bond. So we will need to double check with our industry partners about if those numbers need tweaking since last year's bill was introduced. But I will tell you that in the 2 years between last year. And when the bond was, the first bond was done, those ratios did not change. And therefore, since it's based on a ratio of the size of the bond, I wouldn't expect those numbers to change dramatically. Senator Rahm, you were asking about the volatility of the property transfer tax. And I can tell you that in the first 5 years of the tax, it was between $12 and $15 million a year. But then since 1998, when it was 15 million a year, that has been the floor. It has always been far above that. It grew to a previous peak in 2005 of $45 million, but as Jen mentioned, it's projected to be far higher now. The chart I'm looking at is a year or two old, so it doesn't have the current numbers in it. And even during the financial crisis, the very low point was just shy of $25 million. So in all the years going back to 93, just the July collections of the property transfer tax have covered the debt service for the last bond for the last 20 years. So actually looking at a chart that goes back to 93, for the last 20 years, just what the state has received in July has covered that $2.5 million. So it is a volatile source, as we're seeing that there's an uptick in it now. And yet the $12 million floor to it does seem, I can tell you that our underwriters and rating agencies and investors all feel like that is a very comfortable floor that folks aren't worried are going to, that we have a risk of dropping below. As for defining affordable housing, it is in several places in statute. Becky, you'll probably find it in the Act 250 statute where priority housing projects are defined. Vhcb and VHFA both have statutes where we work with primarily our mission service for low and moderate income folks. Jen can talk about the specific income targeting that the last bond had that was unique to this bond, because this bond was trying to do something of reaching not just the historically low income affordable housing that Vermont has served, but was trying to really include homeownership, as you mentioned, Senator Rahm, and trying to reach into, some might say, the missing middle of the kind of workforce development housing that isn't traditionally eligible for government subsidy, but this bond could support that kind of housing. I will let Jen talk about the homeownership projects that were supported by the bond. I can say that VHFA as a homeownership lender would support a mix, as we had last time, of rental and homeownership options. I think there are a lot of opportunities as we try to reach underserved populations who have not been able to achieve homeownership through market forces, that a government-supported initiative like this could really allow for some specialized targeting and marketing and working with partners to deploy this money in a special way. And I will say that there is nothing I see from the investor bonding side of the equation that should prevent the state from considering doing a bond. This is still a viable option. Interest rates are still low. Interest rates are actually projected to remain low. My belief, based on the economists I listen to, is that interest rates will remain low for probably the next 2 years. So you could take your time a bit with this, and we could try to hit the market as best as possible. That said, we spoke about the Treasurer's concerns about the idea of borrowing versus appropriations. Those are other issues. I'm just here to deliver the news that the markets are still, working well, and I would expect that VHFA could achieve a really good rate, the same strong rating that was achieved last time on the bond, if you structured the bond in a similar way as last time, which is what S34 proposes, is to keep that same kind of structure. And some of those things that help the rating are things like having it be the first however much a PTT revenue that goes to support the bond. Investors don't like being last paid. They want to be first paid. So that's why I'm saying, starting in the fiscal year, those investors were paid with just the July revenues, and so they like being first. They also like knowing that the legislature is committed to keep the property transfer tax revenue at a certain level so that they don't have to worry about if they will get paid, and they want you to keep that. But as I mentioned, with the history that we have of the PTT, right now that seems very feasible to everyone looking at, which is why we achieved a high rating. I'm happy to answer technical questions about the financing or turn it over to Jen to talk about the much more exciting work, which is the question of, what's the good that came out of this investment?
Okay, thank you very much, Maura. Any questions for Maura? So just before we get into Jen's testimony, it's been very helpful. I guess part of the reason for introducing this bill is if there's a significant amount of money being made available for housing, as I've said before, I want to think outside the box as to how we might creatively use that money to produce the most housing possible. And I strongly support the work of Vhcb, and I think they do a remarkable job in leveraging what money we give them to produce a lot of housing. And in full disclosure, my firm represented the Vermont Housing Conservation Coalition for decades, and I was in the room with Governor Dean when the group there decided to use the property transfer tax as a funding source for Vhcb. So I'm tied to this, but at the same time, with that kind of money on the table, are there more creative ideas than just giving all the money to Vhcb and let them figure it out? There very well may not be, but I think this committee should have its antenna up to see if we can find some other idea, other tweaks to maximize. I fully believe in the bonding function, but unfortunately we have other pressures there, but maybe there are some other ideas. And having said that, I know Vhcb supports that kind of thinking as well, the leadership at Vhcb. So Jen, with that introduction, welcome. Good to see you. The floor is yours.
There's a lot to talk about there. Thank you for the opportunity. And let me begin by saying, of course, we're delighted that the governor recognizes the need for more housing. I think that the work that your committee has done, and even the introduction of this bill and the ongoing conversation around the potential of a bond, has set the stage for agreement around housing being a priority and that it being an appropriate place for one-time investments. And so I think maybe that's helped put us where we are today. The first bond was, we think, and I believe it's been your impression too, a big success. You might be delighted to know I don't have an actual presentation for you, so no lots of pictures. I've showed them the results. You've been very gracious about letting us come in and share those results with you in the past, but 843 homes over 23 different communities in 11 counties around the state. And the construction on some of those is finishing up now. It was paused and delayed a little bit when there were construction shutdowns early on in the earlier this year related to COVID, but construction has picked back up and is now underway. And so those are happening around the state. So much that I'd like to share with you. So this news is very fresh to us. In fact, Gus Seelig, our executive director, is just sharing it with our board right now. We only began to understand that there might be a proposal in the governor's budget over the last few days and have seen nothing in writing. So we are very much still absorbing it. And I cannot speak to you today about exactly what we would propose to do it and what proportion of different types of housing would be the best. I think that the priorities that you just looked at in S34 are really appropriate priorities. As we think about what could be done with that 20 million, we might add creating more BIPOC access to homes and thinking about how we create housing options in communities of opportunity a little bit more. And then also, there are 2,000 people in motels right now due to the pandemic, and that it feels like that's got to continue to be a focus for all of us to create permanent homes and help folks transition out of those situations. They are safely sheltered, but they are not in sustainable, viable situations. It's something we all need to try to address together.
Senator Rahm?
Yeah, I mean, speaking of all of those particular populations, I just worry that saying we should prioritize them doesn't really get us there. It doesn't have accountability measures that say we're going to tie ourselves to increasing BIPOC homeownership in the state and closing the gap. So I just wonder how you all feel about kind of real metrics that move the needle on some of these things rather than just sort of, it would be nice to have. I really want to get more scientific with equity in the legislature. It's very like, we're just going to sprinkle it in. But I think we need real numbers. So just want to say that.
Well, I have to confess, one of the reasons I love working is in housing because it's easy to count. You've got an apartment, you've got a home, and you know who lives in it. So those are things that we can report to you. And when things are embedded in legislation as a priority, that's what we do. And then we are accountable to you because we need to come before you every single year and report to you what we've done with those dollars you've decided to entrust to us. So I absolutely appreciate that concern. Later on today and over time, particularly in the area, I think affordable housing is one of the areas of state investment that has done nowhere near well enough, but pretty well in terms of creating more opportunity for people who may have been disadvantaged in the past. And later on this morning, I think in your roundtable is Michael Monty from the Champlain Housing Trust, and they're very attentive and have good data and around who is living in their housing, and he might be able to share with you what the demographics are there. So that's one quick possibility for continuing the conversation about that. I wanted to, so the chairman mentioned leverage and also that the 37 million housing revenue bond did leverage about 200 million in other sources for those projects. When the bond was first proposed, we, and Gus said to you, we would try to achieve a 3-to-1, state funds to other sources for that investment. In the end, it ended up being about 5-to-1. And you might recall that when Gus and I testified last week, we actually showed you a specific project example with a pie chart that showed that the state's investment to the housing revenue bond was about 20% of that total funding. We always try to achieve leverage with other sources. We were fortunate when the bond was issued. It was good timing because of interest rates, but also because Mora happened to get a bump in the amount of federal housing tax credits, and the state housing authority got a bump in the amount of rental assistance that they could contribute to projects. So all those things coming together in addition to coordination between us allowed us to achieve a 5-to-1 leverage in that sense. One of the really exciting things about this the $20 million proposals is that it sets us up really well to take advantage of whatever federal resources may be coming along. $20 million is a lot of money, but we know that the need is enormous. And if the state is really talking about a significant investment here and doing its part, but the federal government has not been meeting its obligations around housing. we would argue that there needs to be significant investment at the federal level, whether in a new infrastructure bill or in some of the stimulus packages that would be made available for creating new homes. And if with this more flexible state funding, it would allow us to wrap around that, fill in gaps, match if needed. It just puts us in a good position in order to make the most of whatever resources may come there. I'm going to just look down at my notes and see what other things that you mentioned. Homeownership under the first housing bond, we did not create as many homeownership units as we would have liked. And I think there are some lessons learned there. And I think that the governor's proposal, both in terms of the funding that would come to us, and I think you'll probably hear more about this later on, the weatherization money that's proposed to go through VHFA and some of the funding through the Department of Housing and Community Development gives us some opportunities to keep working on that. I think the simplest way I can describe it is that there are fewer funding sources for homeownership than there are for rental housing, and especially from the federal government. It takes a lot more state money per home to make something, to rehab it and then make it affordable to someone who's low and moderate income. So it takes a lot more investment, so it's harder to create as many units in that way, honestly. And then also we've tried a number of pilot programs, and I need to check back on the specifics of that, of those results. But while there are many homes in many parts of the state that do need rehab and could be good homes for somebody, they're not necessarily always in the places where people can get jobs, and they are not always necessarily places at a level of investment that where something can be made energy efficient and meet all health and safety codes and still be affordable to somebody. You have to find something that needs some work. It's in a good location, it's got transportation, but isn't completely falling apart. So there's absolutely work to be done there. I don't want to suggest that there isn't, but it takes some good coordination and strategic targeting. And I would hope that we can work with VHFA and the Department of Housing and Community Development to do better around that and than we have in the past. Vhcb has had for many, many years a shared equity program. We call it the Homeland Program, where essentially we provide funding to the nonprofits, to their home ownership centers, and they use that for subsidy, give lower income households a grant. They go out and purchase a home along with the agreement that they'll share the equity when they eventually sell. And that has been a good stepping stone from traditional rental housing to the more traditional and the traditional housing market. It's worked very well in some parts of the state. In some parts of the state, it's not as good a tool. And people are looking at right now to see if there are ways in which that could be made more effective. So I've said a lot. I think I'll pause right there and take the chairman's question.
Couple of questions. When we did the revenue bond last time, I assume that the monies generated from that bond were for the purposes of creating housing, but they did go from the VHFA to VHCB. Did the statute that we passed govern that all of those monies going to VHCB had to be used for housing versus your dual purpose of housing and conservation?
Yes, that's right. It was, the housing bond was very specifically to housing, and actually there were some income targets within that, and more referenced or referred to this a little bit ago. 25% of it was for housing that was more moderate income, or for and 25% was to be for the very lowest income households, and the rest could be anywhere in between, and we were able to meet those targets. So we know that there is a desire, certainly on the governor's part, to still hit both of those demographics. Again, it takes more state funding to do the more moderate income homes, because the federal programs are more targeted to people that are at 65% of the median or below. But one of the lessons learned from the last housing bond is that when we were thinking about worker housing, we thought that would be between 80 and 120% of median. And one of the lessons we learned is that we really should have broadened that target to be, because of the way the federal programs work, specifically more as federal tax credits, 65% to 120% is a better range.
Okay. So thank you for that. My question was more geared towards the mission of VHCB and to use funds they receive as close to 50-50 for housing and conservation. And we overrode that mission on the bond. The bond proceeds should be used exclusively for housing. And I know you haven't seen any language yet, but given that housing, it seems to be, is what driving the governor's suggestion for $20 million, is he going to say that that $20 million be used exclusively for housing? Or is that $20 million, once it gets into your hands, is it going to be $10 million to buy farms and $10 million for housing, or to buy forest land and things like that?
Oh, I'm sorry, I didn't answer the question you asked me before, so I will answer it now. So the housing revenue bond was very specific to housing. The 20 million that the governor is proposing, our understanding is that the emphasis is to be on housing, but we have talked to his staff and they have indicated, because we also feel like, and we touched on this in our testimony last week, that there are programs within Vhcb that greatly support the rural economy and can help with the economic recovery. So we have spoken to the governor's staff around this proposal and urged that we be allowed some flexibility with that in order to fund our conservation activities, like the Farm and Forest Viability Program, the Rural Economic Development Initiative, maybe outdoor recreation projects. And they have indicated to us they'd like us to have some flexibility around that. So we, as I said, we're just beginning to discuss this with our board. We feel it's important to be able to continue to do some of those activities with this funding, but it's not set in stone. So that's, I'm afraid that's as much as I can speak to on that right now. It's brand new.
Okay, well, let's not lose sight of what brought you to this point. I don't think you would have gotten $20 million if it wasn't for the housing crisis. So
yeah, no, understood. We understand that that's the priority.
Excuse me one more second, Mark, because the next question involves you. The huge amount of money going into weatherization, which is going to be run through VHFA. I've read somewhere that the 20 or 25 million through that may produce as much as $70 million in weatherization projects, which is music to my ears, and is also, weatherization is also very closely aligned with housing. So I assume that our committee will have some role in working with natural resources in terms of how we compare those pots of money. But it seems like there may be some creativity going on that we're looking for here in this bill, for instance, with the weatherization money. And I'd like to hear more about why it works there and why we can't multiply here.
I thought that question was going to come at one point. Yes, of the $25 million investment that the governor proposed for weatherization, 16 million of it is slated to come to VHFA as one-time monies. The remaining 9 million is going to support the existing weatherization assistance program through OEO, as well as the state's energy management program. The 16 million in one-time money that's coming to VHFA is intended to be seed money to set up VHFA for to be able to play a new role in the state where we can use weatherization resources instead of being a dollar in, dollar out, which is how our state has traditionally used this money, instead trying to use bonding and other financial tools to expand the pot of money. Some of those other financial tools besides bonding could be building on existing strong programs that already exist, where private lenders put up their capital to support weatherization efforts, and then the public subsidy could fund a loan loss reserve for those lenders, so that there's a shared loss and they don't those loans become less risky. Or the public money could be an interest rate buy down to make those that money more affordable to the lower income Vermonters that VHFA is dedicated to. So one of the reasons that we can take this smaller one-time investment and turn it into something bigger is the difference in the types of loans that we're talking about with permanently affordable housing versus weatherization project. For one, a weatherization project is usually a loan for 10 to 15 years. And so that's a much shorter term than perpetual. So therefore, weatherization doesn't come with the longer lasting affordability provisions. So there's less of public subsidy going to support the weatherization because it helps that household. It will help the next households who buy that home, and so the affordability remains by the ongoing lower utility bills, but it's not the same kind of income-based affordability protections that's so important in the housing that VHCB and VHFA traditionally create in the ways we've been talking about. Also, there is a difference with weatherization loans are a bit more, even if they're just a 0% interest rate, because we can buy down that interest rate, they are still paid back when at least the home sells, if not principal payments for those 10 to 15 years. And that's different than traditional the creation of affordable rental housing, where to remain affordable to tenants in perpetuity, that investment needs to stay in that community, in that housing. And so it's more likely, I think that the better equation of what we're hoping to do with the weatherization investment probably looks more a bit like our VHFA's down payment assistance program, where we give a household some money, but then eventually they do pay it back. And we're revolving that assistance to help more households. We're not keeping that investment in that one property. So those are some of the reasons why you can't give us $20 million and we can turn it into 100 of one-time money. It's just a different beast. It's a different mechanism to do shorter term lending that gets repaid versus the kind of deep investment that we're making in our downtowns and communities through the housing created through the last housing bond.
Well, I'm not sure I follow all that. I'm stuck on the 16 million versus 20 million, and they're very similar numbers. Some of the differences you talk about, the housing bond could be brought down in terms of its perpetual affordability requirements, the lengths of the loans. There could be tweaks that could make it very comparable to the weatherization, and maybe we wouldn't get the ideal bond for housing, but
if I may, I'd like to.
I'm very concerned. I'm skeptical that more can't be done with the $20 million, especially when there's, and we'll hear from the treasurer why she's, I guess, on board with a $16 million program for weatherization that doesn't affect debt service of the state of Vermont, but yet $20 million in a second housing bond is a non-starter for her.
Because I think it's important. I really want to get to clarity on this, and it may take more than one conversation, but a weatherization loan gets repaid every month. And so we can use those loan repayments to pay the bond holders. A PTT bond loan is not repaid every month by the housing property. And so it needs another source to repay those investors. So it uses the PTT revenue. So that is what makes that an ongoing obligation of the state. Weatherization loans get repaid every month and are of a much shorter term. And so after that loan term is done, we can use that money to make another loan. That's very different. When Jen talks about the tremendous leverage that VHCB achieved, it's because the state tax credit program and the federal tax credit program, which all require perpetual affordability, were the main source of money for these projects. So when VHFA awards federal tax credits, it pays for 70% of the cost of construction. And we require with that program perpetual affordability. And so that housing has to remain affordable. And so VHCB is limited in how much they can make loans that get repaid monthly, like a weatherization loan, because that money, that housing development needs to remain affordable. And the more that there's debt that those projects have to pay back, the less affordable that housing gets. And so it would not, if a PTT bond, if the $20 million turned into a bond and was made bigger, it would not be as valuable because the housing development would have to make monthly mortgage payments to pay back that loan over that loan term. And to pay that mortgage payment, the rents would have to be higher.
Well, I guess I have a lot more questions, even if the rents would have to be higher. If it triples the amount of housing that we can develop, maybe it doesn't quadruple or quintuple the amount of housing, but it produces still a multiple of housing. Maybe that's a trade-off that we would be willing to live with. So, I mean, I think we just need to think outside the box, and it's food for thought. We'll talk some more. You're right. It is an interesting comparison, I think, that we need to hear a little bit more about. So I think
Can I leave you with one point of good news? Just, I don't want to leave on a down note. I want to point out to you that in the past, I have made your eyes water with confusion about various federal tax credit programs, and I'm not going to do that. But I want you to know that there are we've talked about how there's two types of tax credits. One is very valuable and limited, and the other one, the treasurer points out to you repeatedly, is pretty much unlimited in Vermont, yet then I show up and say, yeah, but it's not that valuable. The federal government, late in December with the stimulus and the budget, they fixed a systematic problem with that less valuable credit, and it bumps up the value. Not as high as the first credit, but it still really improves the program. And what we know is that right now, the housing projects that are in the queue that have been approved by VHFA or about to be approved in the next month or two, that means another $6.8 million of money for housing in Vermont, which is going to help 467 households in 11 different communities across the state. And those are just the approvals that we have in the pipeline right now. That's going to be that's a permanent fix to this program, so that every year this federal tax credit program is going to remain more valuable to housing in Vermont. So this is now a more meaningful program upon which a state investment could be leveraged. And so it's a great thing for Vermont. And I know that Jen and Gus and I have already been talking about ways that we can try to make sure that we're being really smart about pairing these resources together. And so I just want to end on a good note that would be a wonderful resource with whatever housing investments the state makes, to use that program, those 4% tax credits, as a more valuable leveraging tool.
That is good news. What's the name of the tax credit?
Everyone calls it the 4% federal tax credit compared to the 9% credits, which are that more valuable competitive one. But the 4% credits are the ones that Senator Leahy, Senator Sanders, and Congressman Welch all really have championed for fixing this problem for years, and they finally got over the finish line for us.
could you send us a link to a description of the program and the changes that have been made? I'm sure.
If I may, I'd rather write one myself because all the links
Yeah.
will make your eyes really
Okay.
water. So
Okay,
And
sounds great.
her gift of translating it will be helpful.
Does
Yeah.
anybody have any more questions for our witnesses? We're at our bathroom break for 10 minutes now. And if not, we'll see you all at 9:40 or 9:40.
We do have more questions, but at another time.
Okay? Yes,
Thank
thank
you.
you. Thank you all very much.
Thank you.
Very helpful. Yep, thank you.
Good morning, Polly.
Good morning, Senator Ballant. How are you doing this morning?
I'm doing well. How's your boss?
He's doing okay. He's planning on opening the Senate at 10:30 this morning, and we're all really grateful that
Oh,
seems to
good.
be everything's good with his health.
Yeah, good.
That's great.
My phone was blowing up last night. So many people worried about him. So it's
Yeah.
really nice to hear.
Here,
And how are
here.
you?
Doing all right. I feel like we've spent a lot of time worrying through January, and it'll be we're looking
Yeah.
forward to maybe getting excited about some things in the new Congress.
Yeah. Is your sister still enjoying her work?
She loves it. It's such a good fit, and Wyndham Windsor is such a great organization. So
That's so
really
great.
happy for her. Yeah.
Well, good. Well, I'm going to go grab some coffee and I'll see you again soon.
All right.
Good morning, everybody. We're about to get started. Okay, let me begin by saying how we're going to conduct this roundtable. Thank you all for being here and being available to participate. There's a lot of us, so I'm not going to go around the room and have everybody introduce themselves, but when you do get your first opportunity to speak, if you could introduce yourself and tell us your position and your role would be very helpful. What I'm going to, how I'd like to structure this is I've just given Josh a very short heads up that I'd like him to start and just give us a 5-minute preview of the governor's new housing initiatives in the budget bill and the state of affairs of some of the ongoing housing programs from the most recent two COVID bills. And then we'll turn it over to the congressional delegation to get their view of things of what's in the late December bill, what might be in the president's new bill, and some of the parameters, restrictions, opportunities, what they're looking at, what's being talked about. And then after we get that overview, which probably will take about 20 minutes total, we'll move into having a more free-flowing discussion. I think Nathan sent you all out. What I'm hoping to get at here is how we can think outside the box and develop some housing policies for the state of Vermont that maximizes access to affordable housing. We'll break at, that'll be about 40, we'll break at 10:30 for 10 minutes and we'll come back for 25 minutes after that. And then we'll move into homelessness prevention witnesses. So with that said, thank you again for all being here. And Josh, could you introduce yourself and get us launched?
Sure. Good morning, everyone. For the record, Josh Hanford, Commissioner of Vermont Department of Housing and Community Development. Happy to talk with folks this morning, and I'll just kick things off quickly just by saying that, you know, in my more than or close to 20 years of doing housing work in Vermont, I've never seen, you know, more opportunity before us than we have right now, and at the same time, more need to act quickly and get to work and do what needs to be done out there. You know, there is a gap right now in the money available to both landlords that are housing people with sort of no recourse for non-payment of rent, and of course tenants that need resources to pay their rent, not to fall into worse financial hardship. So with that stage, just quickly run through the housing related items that were in the governor's proposal. I'll start with a few that maybe are not on the top of this committee's this group's list and this roundtable, but do impact in a very positive way housing. So there was a $1.75 million ongoing increase to the downtown tax credits, which is specifically to expand those into the neighborhood development areas. So that's a piece of housing work that we hope is supported, and we can do that ongoing. There was also the Vermont Warms program and involvement with VHFA and others were $25 million for weatherization, which most of that touches housing. About $16 million carved out for Vermont Housing Finance Agency to work on weatherizing low and moderate income homes and apartments. Another $4 million for programs in AHS with the low-income heating assistance program for fuel switching and system switching, and another $5 million that really isn't housing, but for municipal buildings to do weatherization. And then getting into more of the specific areas that we're going to talk about more is additional $3 million for the Vermont Housing Investment Program. 3 of that is one time and 1 million of that is in our base for ongoing support. And that is split between rental rehab of apartments that are, vacant, offline, code deficiencies, as well as new homeowner purchase rehab with a set aside or a target for BIPOC community in Vermont. Then we also have the mobile home replacement tax credit. There's an increase there specifically for that of $250,000 of ongoing support to more than double the resources that are going into that successful program year over year. As a reminder, those credits are sold by Vhcb, and the proceeds granted to Champlain Housing Trust, which runs a statewide program to replace old, non-energy efficient mobile homes with new Energy Star and zero energy modular homes across the state. It acts as a 0% deferred second mortgage that's paid back upon sale or transfer, and that money recycles, and it's essentially a self-sustaining program at this point that does a lot of good work across the state. And then there's the governor's proposal to significantly increase Vhcb's budget this year, bringing it up to it's actually $30.8 million as I've looked into the details. So a more than $20 million increase over last year's budget. So hopefully that rounds out the sort of housing proposals that the governor presented and kicks us off for some discussion. Is that what you're hoping for, Senator Strachan?
You're muted, Michael.
Exactly. Yes. Thank you very much, Josh. Okay, let's move on to the congressional delegation. We'll go by seniority. Polly.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Polly Major. I'm a field representative for Senator Leahy covering housing here in Vermont. And thank you for inviting us all in. I think how we're going to divide up our congressional update is I'll give an overview of the bill that was passed in December. Alex Beaton from Senator Sanders' office will talk about Biden's proposal for new coronavirus legislation, and Rebecca Ellis from Congressman Welch's office will talk about how we're working with Treasury on the rental assistance program that was authorized in December. So I can start us off. I shared with the committee a federal housing resources document that my office put together that outlines the federal housing resources in the bill passed in December. So the December bill was really in three parts. You had the FY21 appropriations, the funding for the government for this year. There was a portion of the bill that was authorizing language relating to existing and new programs. And then there was the $900 billion coronavirus relief package, the second package that we've seen. For the fiscal year 21 appropriations section of that bill, this was the second year of a 2-year budget agreement. So we didn't have a lot of big changes in the federal funding for housing programs. You can see in the document that I've shared, we've laid out what the major housing programs received in fiscal year 20 versus fiscal year 21. Small increases, but fairly steady across the board. So if you're looking ahead at what Vermont expects to receive in this upcoming year, you can really use what it received last year as a proxy. So I just want to give the committee that sense. There's a lot of individual programs, so I'm not going to run through them all. But I wanted to provide that context around the fiscal year 21 budget. Senator Leahy was vice chair of the Senate Appropriations Committee as they negotiated this bill. And he said he was glad to put a final nail in the coffin of the Trump budget proposals that have gutted most of these housing programs. So we're glad to see they still exist. And he's looking forward to serving as chair of the Appropriations Committee moving forward and strengthening our country's investments in housing. For the coronavirus portion of that bill, the program that's probably of most interest to this committee is the rental housing assistance, emergency rental assistance program. And this program is authorized through the Treasury Department, much like the Coronavirus Relief Fund. However, it has some real significant differences from the CRF fund. It's a much more defined and rigid program with specific language in the bill about how it needs to be implemented in the state. So through that program, there's $25 billion nationally, and there's a small state minimum that ensures that Vermont will receive and has received $200 million to implement that program. I do want to flag for this committee some of the eligibility requirements that are outlined again in the statute that set this program apart from Vermont's existing rental assistance program that you all stood up with CRF dollars. So the most significant difference is that there is means testing included in this program. So to be eligible to receive this funding, renter or households must be at or below 80% AMI. They also have to be able to show that they have some financial hardship that's related to COVID, though there's certainly room for interpretation about what that looks like. The bill also prioritizes for funding for households that are below 50% AMI and those experiencing unemployment. The $200 million, while wonderful, does come with some very strict deadlines that are coming up pretty quickly. The first deadline is September 30th, 2021, where the bill says that the secretary shall recapture excess funds and reallocate those funds to grantees who have obligated 65% of their allocation or more, which should mean that Vermont, in order to receive funding past September, will need to have spent down that 65% of the $200 million. After September, the secretary has some discretion on how the funds are reallocated. The reallocation is based on demonstrated need within the district or a jurisdiction, but the statute doesn't define what that looks like and how those funds will be reallocated. Once they are reallocated, the funds are available through December 30th, 2021, with an option for grantees to request a 90-day extension. So this is a short-term rental program that is targeted to households that are below 80% AMI. And those two things really set it apart from the program Vermont stood up with CRF. So I want to flag that, and I'm sure we'll have lots more discussion on what that means for the state and what that looks like as we try to implement this program. So with that, I think I'm going to turn it over to my colleague in Senator Sanders' office.
Thank you, Polly. Alex.
Good morning, everyone. For those of you who don't know me, my name's Alex Beaton. I'm a policy advisor for Senator Sanders in the Senate Budget Committee based in the DC office, although I am a proud Vermont native. So happy to walk through what President Biden has put out so far and kind of some of the next steps in Congress as we look forward to the current session. So as you all know, and I believe Polly shared a document with the committee on this, the president released a plan that would spend $1.9 trillion, the American Rescue Plan related to kind of the immediate public health needs, including vaccination, economic support for working families, and aid to communities. Wanted to highlight some items of interest to the committee and for this roundtable. An additional $25 billion in funding for emergency rental assistance, $5 billion in additional funding to secure stable housing for persons experiencing or at risk of experiencing homelessness. The plan calls on Congress to extend the federal eviction and foreclosure moratorium through at least September. However, that would likely not affect states like Vermont that have their own moratoriums on the books. $350 billion in additional funding to state and local governments to ensure they don't need to decrease public services or cut public jobs in order to keep up with just the rising needs like distributing the vaccine, reopening schools, and other services. So, the president's plan is, as you all see from the document, it's only 19 pages. It's mainly focused on kind of these top line numbers. So it will be left to Congress to kind of sort out the parameters of these various programs. We certainly have heard and hope to continue to hear from you all some of the needs for Vermont and issues with the existing programs that I think Rebecca will speak to that we'll keep in mind as we shape the programs. So I think some of the issues around the rental assistance program that Congress will consider, things like the time limit and recapture provisions for rental payments, other aspects of that program. So looking forward to hearing more from you all about that. So Congress is going to need to take this plan and turn it into legislation. I think we are actively keeping the March 14th deadline for the expiration of the enhanced unemployment benefits in mind. And as we continue this process, it's certainly our hope, certainly President Biden's hope, that this relief will be passed on a bipartisan basis. And I understand some of those discussions are already in the early phases, but we should know more soon. But I would say, if not, as the incoming chairman of the Senate Budget Committee, Senator Sanders is prepared to use the budget reconciliation process to pass COVID relief. Reconciliation is a special congressional budget tool that allows us to pass budgetary legislation on a fast track basis without being subject to the 60-vote filibuster in the Senate. So happy to answer any questions about that. But looking a little longer term, we also expect President Biden to release a recovery plan based on his Build Back Better plan he discussed during the campaign. In that plan, we expect to be largely focused on kind of investments in infrastructure and addressing climate change. And this could be an opportunity for efforts on things like housing capital investments and other energy efficiency and weatherization programs. So with that, I'll turn it over to my colleague in Congressman Welch's office.
So Alex, I have one question. Is there a small state minimum proposed, or is for the next bill, or is that always the case that there's a small state minimum in these kinds of bills?
I would say that the Biden plan does not address a small state minimum. He has left that up to Congress. But it certainly has always been Senator Sanders' hope that we ensure that states like Vermont with lower populations receive their fair share of funding.
And could you just give us, in terms of additional rental assistance, I think you had a number in there. What would that, do you know what that would translate to for Vermont and additional funds if there was a small state minimum and if there was not a small state minimum?
I don't think those details have been put out by, those are still being considered by Congress. If we adopt the 25 billion recommendation from the president, what the small state minimum would look like. So I don't want to give you all a number and then it will change in the coming weeks. So we'll definitely let you all know.
For any, what was the overall number in the December bill for rent assistance? Was that 25 billion as well? Okay.
Yes. So, if that is precedent, then that $200 million small state minimum could continue. But, again, this would be subject to another round of congressional negotiations. So that could certainly change.
Okay. Rebecca, good to see you. I'm not sure you've ever testified before our committee before, but good to have you back in the State House virtually.
Virtually here. Well, thank you. It's fun to be here. So for the record, my name is Rebecca Ellis, and I'm the state director for Congressman Welch. It's fun to be here today, and the congressman says hello to everyone. And he wanted to also mention that he was able to visit the Holiday Inn in Burlington in, I think it was October, where CBOEO had created housing for homeless and people facing housing instability. And he found this really an inspiring visit. And overall, he's just been so impressed with all the work that all of the partners here on this call today have done to find creative ways to help people who are facing housing instability. And I was on a call a couple months ago. I don't remember who it was who said it, but I think it was someone on this panel, just mentioned the fact that housing instability is really facing so many people these days. And the face of housing instability is really diverse now, from young people facing student debt to middle-aged people who lost their jobs to older Vermonters who are on fixed incomes. So it's really a problem across the state and for all people. The congressman has really been pushing hard for more money to go into the Coronavirus Relief Fund. As I think you know, Vermont was allocated $1.25 billion in March through the CARES Act, and that has really helped the state through this this period and this hardship, and hopefully we'll get more of that type of money, because it is that flexible money that comes to the state that allows the state to continue funding programs that really work for the state of Vermont. And so, as Polly has already mentioned, there was this great program, the $25 billion nationally, or $200 million for Vermont, for the Emergency Rental Assistance Program. But that does come with some pretty strict guides that have to be worked out. And Congressman Welch did meet in late December with Commissioner Hanford and with housing stakeholders and partners to talk a little bit about that program and to hear from folks what their concerns were. And the department has provided us with, and the delegation, with 5 pages of questions about how that program is going to work. And unfortunately, we really don't have the answers quite yet to those questions. But suffice it to say, it will not probably be as flexible as the money that came through the Coronavirus Relief Fund. And some of the big questions that have already been hinted at are how to define eligibility, and what is the paperwork requirement for meeting eligibility? What is going to be the definition of other housing expenses? There is some allowance for money to go to other housing expenses, but depending on how that's interpreted, it could create opportunity in Vermont or not. And so we'll really just have to see how that comes out. The Trump administration, on the day before it left office, so on the 19th, issued a 4-page frequently asked questions through the Treasury Department. And I think most people felt that those guidelines really didn't answer any questions. And if they did anything, they made it harder to access this money than necessary. Congressman Welch joined a letter yesterday asking the Treasury Department to rescind those 4 pages of frequently asked questions and just start anew. The delegation has been seeking out contacts with the new administration at the Treasury, and Senator Leahy's office was able to get an answer within 1 day yesterday, or at least a response, maybe not an answer, but provided the questions from the department to the new Treasury, got a response within 1 day, which is really promising. Even if not all the answers are exactly what we want, at least we're getting some answers. So the other sort of route that we have for working on getting regulations is through the Senate Banking Committee, who has a direct line with the Treasury Department to implement the program. So again, the Senate offices are working directly with the Senate Banking Committee. And so I think that's it for the update. And just to stress that Congressman Welch certainly knows that the flexible money is the preferred money, and we'll continue fighting for that. Chair Sorokin, you had a question about how much money would come to the state of Vermont with the new, the Biden proposal. The CARES Act the CARES 2.0 Act had a similar amount of money devoted to states and local governments, and the total amount that came to the state and local governments was around $800 million. Those were the last estimates that I saw, just to give you a ballpark idea of how much money has been floated in the recent proposals. So thank you, and I look forward to your questions, and thanks for having the delegation here today.
Is there any way to translate that 800 million to what piece of that pot would be for rent assistance?
Yeah, so that would be the equivalent of the money that came to the state in the coronavirus relief fund. So you would compare that to the 1.25 billion, and there was pretty, there were some guidelines to that, but there was a lot of discretion given to the state on where to allocate the money. And so the same would be for this pot of money.
Right, but that was subject to the small state minimum, the 1.25. That's why we got so much money, and the small state minimum would be 800 million in this second COVID. But I'm just wondering, if we didn't get the small state minimum, what Vermont would get in rental assistance. People are saying 200 million under the small state minimum, but I assume it's far less if we don't get that small state minimum for rental assistance.
So there's two different pots of money. So there was the 25 billion proposed by President Biden for rental assistance, where there may or may not be a small state minimum. And there was also, Alex gave the full number, it was somewhere in the 350 billion that would go to state and local governments. And on that, again, there's no, for the President Biden's proposal, we don't really have a breakdown, or a small state minimum at this point. But the last time that 350 billion number was being floated around, it translated to about a total of 800 million to the state of Vermont in both state and local, for both state and local governments.
Okay. Just before we leave this, and we'll probably be talking about this, but if the goal of a small state minimum under the Biden, under the December bill is to be achieved, with some degree of certainty, the Biden bill has to, put as one avenue, has to extend greater flexibility to the funds from the COVID-2 bill in December. It's probably a naive question. I don't know how Washington works, but do people respond to that kind of argument? You wanted to give us this amount of money in December. It's not working for us, so we need to correct that. Or is that just totally a political question?
I think if we look,
Go
look at the national context, with many states that did not do what Vermont did and stand up a rental assistance program, there is a lot of need out there. So I think from a national perspective, altering the rental assistance program is going to be difficult, because I know there are advocates that are pushing hard for that income eligibility that is in there. So certainly we, from a Vermont perspective, would like to see additional flexibility, but I'm not sure how likely that is to go into a next bill. And I think where our bosses are going to be focusing, or my boss is going to be focusing, and Rebecca said the same about Congressman Welch, is getting additional state and local aid that really has that flexibility that Vermont needs and has done such a great job with in the past.
Okay, we're gonna open it up to the rest of the folks in the round table, and a person that might be a good place to start, but anybody can jump in with questions or comments, would be Richard Williams and the challenges he sees as the opportunities and the challenges that he sees with this $200 million that's come in the December bill, and where you are and the other stakeholders in Vermont are in assessing that at the present time.
Good morning, Senate committee members, and thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I just want to say thank you to this committee and to the leadership, especially Senator Srotkin, over the years that you've always been strong and loud and have always supported, housing for Vermonters. And we always look forward to testifying before you, even though you asked some pretty tough questions. I will tell you what we know at this time regarding the $200 million. I think you've heard from other testimony that it's going to be less flexible than the CF dollars that we've received earlier. As you know, we were successfully ran rental assistance arrearage program. This committee worked well with us and Vermont Legal Aid and Vermont Landlords Associations, and like many states, there was restrictions on how far rental arrearage went back. A lot of them chose not before March 1st. Vermont stood up there as different, much more flexible, realizing that, low-income renters had problems prior to COVID, paying rent in Vermont. We have high rents in Vermont. I think everybody knows that. And many were behind even prior to COVID. This committee took the position and the legislature took the position that it was housing and health. It was important not to evict anyone or create a homeless situation, especially during the COVID period. And as a result of that, I think the program was successful, and that's why we're asking you to give us $2.8 million so we can fund the last 1,500 applications that we have on the table. Some of the congressional testimony you've already heard about the Biden proposal. That $25 billion, I think, will come down in the way of the regular federal programs, and it will be, from what I've been reading, it will be like the Housing Choice Voucher Program, and that will be allocated to local housing authorities and to other entities that administer the Housing Choice Voucher Program on a national basis. And here in Vermont, it's obviously my agency, along with 8 other public housing authorities. There won't be a lot of flexibility with that, but there is the benefit of receiving it by the way of Housing Choice Vouchers is that we can make those into project-based vouchers. There's a percentage that under the rules and regulations and the laws under the HUD program that allows us to make basically 25% of our allocation of our total Housing Choice Voucher program, and we can allocate that towards project-based vouchers. And if you really want to get affordable housing in Vermont, you need to combine rental assistance along with mortgage monies and the low-income housing tax credits and Vhcb funding and CDBG. You need all those sources of fund really to create affordable housing here in the state of Vermont. But rental assistance is really critical if you're going to serve the low-income housing population. Typically, we're assisting, as high as 75% of our monies under the Section 8 voucher program go to folks below 30% of median income. And without that assistance, as much as the tax credit program is a great production program, without rental assistance, many of those folks wouldn't be able to get into that beautiful housing that's being developed by for-profits and nonprofits here in Vermont. So we're looking forward to that. The $200 billion will frankly be a challenge for Vermont to spend under the current FAQs, as was mentioned, that was issued the day before the president left the office. These FAQs were issued as it was already previously said, probably has caused more confusion than it has helped. So we have been working, with the administration and Agency of Commerce Community Development has been putting together many questions that now our congressional folks are submitting to our new treasurer and secretary. And we're all hoping for more flexibility, but we also understand that the act really sets the guidelines. There's a lot of statutory changes that we think would be helpful to make, but I think the likelihood of getting those statutory changes would be very difficult, and it's probably not the time to open that up for discussion. Hopefully maybe some changes may be able to come through the budget process later, but that's going to be very late, as you know, in 2021 when we will see a federal budget. But Hopefully that there can be some extensions to this money. Senator Reid from Rhode Island originally had pushed that grantees have until December of 2022 to obligate the funds, and had an additional 90 days to expend that money. So there are, and also Senator Reid from Rhode Island. Why I'm mentioning Rhode Island, some of you may remember Amy Raynone that worked for Senator Leahy's office probably 20 years ago. Amy works for the Rhode Island Housing Authority as their legislative director and policy. So Amy and I have been keeping in touch. As you know, she's a Vermonter from St. Johnsbury as well. They haven't been able to be as flexible as the state of Vermont. They've been sort of under a gag order of not asking a lot of questions, from their administrations and such. Fortunately, in Vermont, we're not afraid to ask questions. So Commissioner Hanford has been asking a lot of questions. So we do have a lot of recommendations. We'd like to see the assistance extended from 18 to 24 months. Right now, it's 12 months and potentially with additional 3 months. But our challenges will be getting that money out the door quickly. And so we're working with you folks. We were invited into the Senate Appropriations Committee by Senator Kitchell about 2 weeks ago, Commissioner Hanford and myself. And they put me on the spot. They says, how much money would you like? And I said, well, I'd like a placeholder of $50 million to begin with. I thought that was a reasonable amount to ask for out of the 200 million. And it's twice what we spent in 6 months. So it seemed like it was a realistic number to ask for. We could then start setting up this program, which is going to be very expensive. As I said, there's less flexibility. There's lots of, in our past program, we relied on self-certification. We're asking for that now. And I'm not sure if we're going to get that or not. But if we have to do all the means testing and we have to verify, W-2s and unemployment, through third parties or whatever, it's just going to drag and slow down the program. But so I've had conversations with Commissioner Hanford about trying to combine Section 8 funding, the housing choice vouchers with a rental rehab program, HUD. Because you can look at my face, you can say how old I am. I've been around here a long time and can remember when HUD actually had a program that combined rental subsidies with capital dollars. And Vermont did receive allocations of that, and it was a successful program. And sometimes when you have successful programs, they get canceled because they cost too much. So something similar like that in Vermont, I think would be very helpful because of the program that we're just wrapping up, their rental housing stabilization program. A lot of landlords have a lot of vacant units out there. They do not have money to make those repairs. And anything that we could do to help them would help with the shortage of affordable housing here in Vermont. And we need everyone. We need nonprofits, we need for-profits. We all need to be working on this problem. But the clear thing is we have definitely a shortage in housing and affordable housing for low-income families. We didn't do a means testing through the rental housing stabilization program, but we did ask them to, kind of indicate where their income was for their household. And I can tell you that they're very low to low-income folks that we serve through that program. I'll stop because I know you got a lot of people here and always available to you folks.
Mr. Chair, you're on mute, and I also have a question. You have a chance.
Thank you. I just wanted to say that this is the first of many conversations on this topic, and there's many interest groups that have contacted us that want to be part of this discussion, including realtors and local public housing authorities, some regional groups, and we will have all those people in the discussion as we move forward. I'll take your question in a second, Senator Rahm, but that's a good start. What I wrote to folks is that we want to make as strong of an effort as possible to use all these resources that are available to us. My understanding is that this group of people here has been meeting with the commissioner on a weekly basis or whatever, and we want to be, this committee wants to be kept abreast of what those conversations are. So this, hopefully the rest of this half hour or 45 minutes that we may have, we can start brainstorming about ideas of which way we can somehow gain greater flexibility. We've already heard of a few ideas, but would like people to weigh in. Nothing's beyond the bounds of discussion here. It's just a brainstorming session, but our committee needs to hear what you folks have been, you experts have been thinking about as to how we can maximize the use, at the very least, of that $200 million. Senator Rahm.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So I know we have Champlain Housing Trust here. I don't know what it means to not have Burlington and Winooski housing authorities here, just in the kind of framing around how to help particularly low-income BIPOC families. I feel like they have a very high concentration of those folks who might benefit from a program to transition them to homeownership. I think that would probably end up being pretty concentrated in Chittenden County. And so I think we need to also address that it's hard to have BIPOC people move their lives to somewhere more rural in Vermont if they're not feeling safe or connected to community. So wanted to flag that and just say, because it's a pet issue of mine, that I really like Senator Sanders signing on to something that would look like the green workforce in the New York City area that helps get people in low-income housing into jobs that fix up housing, weatherize housing, and help them maybe do the rehab projects as well. So just trying to think about how we get really creative to make sure this works for people of color and people in affordable housing to access jobs and home ownership.
If I could quickly respond to you, Senator Rahm, through the Housing Choice Voucher Program, the federal program, there is a home ownership program with that, so where that they can actually use that voucher to pay for mortgage and cost of home ownership. Vermont State Housing Authority has had a successful run with that money and have created a lot of great opportunities. And I think there's I'm sure we could team up with a lot of folks in Vermont Housing Finance Agency and others that are on this and be pretty creative. We've also worked very closely with the U.S. Department of Agriculture, USDA, Rural Development. We've worked very closely with their homeownership programs and have many people that receive mortgages through that federal agency, and in using this voucher, as flexible as we can. It has created a lot of housing opportunities, homeownership opportunities that wouldn't have happened. Thank you.
Michael Monty.
Senator Sorokin, thank you for this opportunity. Senator Rahm, thank you for the question. We have done more access to vouchers for home ownership than anyone nationally. Burlington Housing Authority itself has been very active working with us on doing that. And we also take the importance of getting folks who are people of color into home ownership, into our rental housing. A good number of our rental housing properties do have people of color, and about 25% of the sales of our home ownership over the last 5 years have been for people of color. So we are leaning into it. I was late for this meeting because I was at the Vermont Housing Conservation Board meeting, and we do have the support of the Vermont Housing Finance Agency on this one. I want to thank Maura for that, to actually do a very specific project in Winooski to support people of color moving into home ownership. And we are looking for ways night and day to be able to do this within the context of, remarkably enough, the federal laws that discriminate against people. So we are working through that and working through their various group, Racial Justice Alliance. I had a conversation with Mark yesterday. We're working with the AALV and a range of others to really move that as best as we can and as strongly as we can. So we take that to heart and be glad to have conversations with you about the work we're doing with the city of Winooski and in Burlington also. If I could just reflect on what Dick Williams has said, I think that with the $200 million, I think flexibility is the key word here. Self-certification is really important. It was difficult to go through the process we went through in the last 6 months. That money was essential for renters, for our renters and for our properties in order for us to be successful, but for landlords and renters across the state. It was still nevertheless pretty flexible relatively in terms of how it was going to work compared to the new rules. And so for our delegation here and I think our delegation in Washington, allowing for self-certification for our tax credit properties, allowing for different systems to allow people to get that rental assistance more easily is going to be key. The second part of that flexibility is in terms of timing. I agree with Dick also. More time, the better. The other part of that flexibility is we may not use that $200 million. And frankly, in Chittenden County, our issue as much as anything is production. We need more of that. We have a 1.5% vacancy rate as of June. Still, no matter how many units we built over the last few years of private sector housing and even affordable housing, the vacancy rate went down again. People are moving here. If you go to Reddit, which I do on occasion, I don't want to admit that too much, it's remarkable how many folks are moving to Vermont because it's easier and better here than it is from the communities that they're escaping from. The impact and the demands on the market are strong. And I think Maura could speak to, I think she has a number of 2,000 new households being formed, I think in Chittenden County over the next 5 years. I think I got that correct. If that's the case, and we're lagging in production this past year and may in the future, frankly, we're going to be not get out of the continued need for production. So production with programs that Dick runs and the housing authorities run and services depending upon the population of people we are working with are all sort of critical pieces, and flexibility in that $200 million or the next round of stimulus money is really going to be important. So we just that would be my pitch for you today.
Thank you very much. That's very helpful. That's exactly what I wanted to hear, is starting to get a laundry list of ideas. I've heard some others out of the box, like paying for the shelter allowance for TANF recipients out of this, freeing up perhaps general fund dollars, or the impact this might have on the renters rebate program. If people's rent is paid, is there money to be used there? Those kinds of ideas. So it's about our break time. We'll take 10 minutes now, unless somebody has a pressing question, and we'll come back for about a half hour. I don't know what that is. Come back for about a half hour and wrap up. We'll hear from everybody who's on the call, but please, we want to focus on creative thinking of ideas of how we can get some greater flexibility into this $200 million. Thank you very much.
Mr. Chair? Mr. Chair?
Yes, Senator Ballant. I don't
Okay,
see
just
I don't see
briefly
your
before
hand.
I know, that's because I'm a disembodied voice.
Right.
Before we go to the break, I just want to mention one thing that I was reflecting on with our money chairs yesterday and thinking about the budget address that we heard, is that I want all of us on this committee to really see that budget address from the governor as a reflection of a point in time. And what I mean by that is, over the next few weeks and months, we're going to probably be getting more federal funds. And so I want us to make a laundry list of creative ideas for the money that we know that we have right now. But I also would love to have an additional list, which is, what are we going to do and in what order if more flexible funds come to us in Vermont? Because I feel pretty strongly that will happen at some point. Just wanted to make that plug.
Yeah, I agree. You and I have talked a bunch, and I know we're in agreement about this moving target phenomenon. And it's really hard to lock on a decision when the sands are going to shift underneath your feet at any moment. So we're on the
Exactly.
same page,
Right.
and we will definitely be keeping that in mind. So we'll see everybody in 10 minutes. Thank you very much. Welcome back, everyone. Let me see, I'm trying to get my, can we go back live? Oh, we are live, okay. Nathan, how do we get rid of the pause screen with the Vermont logo on there?
I'm sure he's about to get rid of it. I'll just text him. He may have.
Okay.
Somebody's not on mute. There's a lot of. I just texted him. Oh, screen. Would help if I could spell it right.
I guess we can begin even without, with that flag in front of, oh, there we go. Okay.
There we are.
Okay.
Thank you, Nathan.
Thank you, Nathan. So I want to make sure everybody gets, who was invited, gets a chance to speak. We have about 35 minutes left before we hear from homelessness advocates at 11:15. Let me just go around and pick people to add to the conversation from where we were going with any thoughts they may have. I'm going to suggest we start with Maura.
I'm happy to jump in, although you hear from me a lot. So I think there's a lot of people, just out of fairness, I'll just say briefly in support of what Michael was saying about the strong need and demand and well, let me slow down. The appreciation for this committee for so doggedly pursuing this topic year after year and not giving up, because the need has clearly not gone away yet. We do get so much more than just wealth from what we build with real estate. We know that real estate is the biggest source of private assets. It dwarfs stocks, bonds, and all that, but it's more than just money. It's the built environment can provide health, innovation, community connection, culture. As Senator Rahm keeps speaking to, access. And so there is a need for creative thinking around this. And I sometimes sense from this committee and other legislators that it's like, okay, you want us this time, we're going to roll up our sleeves and we're going to get creative and think outside the box. And just, I'm on some national boards of other state housing agencies, and I really want to reassure you that in so many ways, what is happening here as the normal course of business is the thinking outside the box. In Vermont, we are doing things that other states are desperate to learn more about. I spend a good chunk of my life, my working days, answering calls from other state housing finance agencies, wondering about how did you get CRF money to pay for capital? We were told that was, a bright line no. And yet between the governor's administration, the legislature's support, Vhcb's strong network of nonprofits they support, it happened. Richard was right. The homeownership program of Section 8, we've won awards in Vermont because we have used that pairing of Section 8 for homeownership more than any other state. And there's so much that we naturally do here that already is outside the box that at some point we just start looking a little illegal with our 4 pages of questions for the US Treasury about, I know you said rental assistance, but could I define that as, something that's really pushing the envelope? I will put in one plug or question if you want to know what other thoughts besides what you've already heard over email or testimony, and that would be the 200 million of rental assistance also goes to utility assistance. And as you heard yesterday, VHFA is going to be playing hopefully a larger role in supporting the great weatherization work that OEO and all the weatherization contractors have been implementing for decades. And so I'd like to look at that utility assistance allowed for with that 200 million and find out if there's a way that that could be some kind of down payment or loan source of a weatherization loan or program. And I don't have that answer. It overwhelms me to think about what that would look like, but that is something that we plan to look into and pursue in partnership with our congressional delegation, as well as traditional weatherization partners, to see if we could use some of that utility assistance that can only be used this year. And is there any way we could make some strong down payments on some meaningful weatherization efforts? But again, I already talked too much. I think it'd be great to hear from others. Unless you had questions, always happy to answer.
Well, I appreciate that, and no one's going to ever accuse you of not being creative more. Don't worry. The weatherization, I want to talk with and get together with Senator Bray on that. I mean, I'm wondering if the weatherization grants or loans can be made so attractive that that pot of money could leverage other housing repairs for people who want that money. So I'm always interested in using these pots of money as carrots to bring some private sharing or contributions into the equation.
Commissioner Hanford and I have talked about that, and that's another reason to really, why VHFA really supports the governor's VHIP program, is that we've been talking about ways to use these two programs together, because the VHIP program is modeled on taking some private equity of the landlord and pairing it with some public resources. And so if that program can pay for the housing rehabilitation, and then the weatherization funding can pay for some kind of loan to support the energy efficiency. And then maybe we could bring in some of OEO's money to provide a grant if the ultimate household was eligible. Maybe I'm getting too creative, but there's different ways that we are talking about pairing these resources to be most efficient and leveraging them all with each other to get the most bang for the buck.
Right.
Senator Clarkson.
Yeah, I'd love to just tag on to Maura's thought, because we could also, and I don't know if this is possible because I know there's such a tight income, there's so many tight income restraints around this 200 million, but we could also, as we look at weatherization, we could also look at higher, the middle crowd, middle income people who are desperate to switch out of fossil fuel and into heat pumps. And I'm wondering if we can also, use it as a stimulus to really move people in some substantive way off of what they want to get off of, and help finance that as we look at an all fuels efficiency model, and that it would be partnering with natural resources. So it's I'm wondering if we can possibly do that at the same time.
Yes, fuel switching is absolutely a part of the proposal that we are planning. And when I say weatherization work, it absolutely includes that.
Great.
Okay. Jen, do you have some thoughts about what you've heard so far?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chair. Briefly, appreciate the opportunity you have put in front of us to think creatively. And I think it's really important for us to always be checking our assumptions about the way that we do things, and to take a hard look at those. At the same time, there's much of the work that we do that does work really well and has performed well over time, and I want us to be able to build on that. Appreciate, as always, the strong support from the delegation for the federal home program. Senator Leahy's a national leader on that. Senator Sanders created and has continued to fight for the National Housing Trust Fund program, both of which are capital sources and can help us address the supply problem over time, and we hope that those will be considered favorably in any upcoming legislation. I just want us also, if it's okay, to think about the capacity. I think we have incredible opportunity, as Josh mentioned, with this potential funding, and a lot of folks that work in this realm have been working at a sprint for months and months and months. So if there are ways in which we can support decisions that's going to allow them to get going faster and more efficiently, and I'm thinking about the State Housing Authority, it's terrific that the legislature is going to give them, or at least the Senate's approved another 2.8 in CRF to allow them wrap up those applications of folks that are already qualified and are just sitting waiting, and then is about to give them a signal for 10 million at least to get the new program up and going. So that's going to really help their capacity challenge, and we're really appreciative of the Senate's support for that and hope the House will do the same. So I think those are just just really a couple high level things that I'll leave for now.
Okay.
Oh, I'm sorry. Nope. I thought of one more thing. Mobile home parks. We know that this committee's been very supportive of mobile home parks and infrastructure. We know there's a tremendous amount of need there. We'd love to see that in a federal infrastructure bill. We'll be thinking about it with the 20 million that the governor has proposed, if that's what others think make a lot of sense. And I'm really delighted about the governor's proposal to increase the state tax credit for the manufactured housing program.
Okay. Sarah, we're going to be talking more about homelessness later this morning. We had some witnesses last week, and I'm not sure in my time that every time we've wanted to have you in, either you or I have been unavailable. So I want to welcome you. I've heard wonderful things about your work.
Yeah, thank you, Senator Sorokin, and thanks to the committee. I know you guys have been paying a lot of attention to this issue, and it's been a while since I've been in front of you. So, I'll just try and add to what my colleagues around the state have already mentioned, which I think is, some really important points. I think I should definitely highlight the fact that as of today, we have almost 1,900 households that DCF is housing in motels around the state. And to that, another 300 plus households in emergency shelters around the state as well. So I think the numbers are still large, and I think that always speaks to the point that others were making around the level of housing instability that that folks are facing. We have been in conversation with Commissioner Hanford's team and the State Housing Authority. Obviously, one major outstanding question is whether or not that emergency rental assistance funds will be able to be made use to help folks who are not currently in housing, right? Could we use those funds to help people exit motels into rental housing? And I think that's an outstanding question we're still trying to answer. That being said, of those 1,900 households in motels, we did issue quite a bit of rental assistance funds through, our HUD Emergency Solutions Grant funds and through some CRF funds paired creatively with the Vermont rental subsidy. And, more than 180 households have already been leased up and exited motels into housing. Another 265 have been approved for vouchers and are actively seeking housing. And of those, mostly they're families, right? So we know of the folks in motels, about 250 are households with children. And many of them have housing vouchers and are seeking housing. And so I say that just to raise up the point that one of the primary barriers is just the availability of housing stock across the state. And I think that point's been made, but I think when we look at, those folks seeking housing have been doing that for 2 months, 3 months, 4 months, right? So it's not a small effort to find a unit that's available. So I just want to also just lift up I think Jen was saying the hard work of folks who've been sprinting. I think that's a right statement for many months now, and that includes our community partners that are continuing to do the work on the ground to work with folks in households to help get them rehoused. So I think one of the key things that we are continuing to think about at DCF is how we help rehouse households. What are the strategies we need at play? How are we leveraging services? How are we continuing to fund additional services. I know we're ready to partner with the State Housing Authority where it will be allowed to qualify folks who may be in benefits programs, right, which is one way that we can support the eligibility piece. You know, we looked at some numbers at DCF, and here I get outside of the work of OEO a little bit because we don't administer the benefit programs at OEO. My colleagues at Economic Services do that, but you know, they pulled some data, and of the folks, you know, in 3 Squares, Vermont, who are renter households, there's more than 7,000, right? So we know there are a lot of renter households out there who are living with very low incomes, who have been their financial security has been negatively impacted because of COVID. And I think we're a ready and willing partner to reach out to those households and help them apply for rental assistance if and when that becomes available. So I think for us, it's looking to move forward with those programs quickly, those things that we know work and we need to do. And so we're looking forward to that. And then I'll just, you know, I'll mention that the governor's budget proposal also included a shift for a long time that we've been looking to make in the next state fiscal year to actually end the general assistance motel voucher program and instead shift those investments to the community. And so I know that's not the goal of this conversation this morning to talk about that, but I need to bring it to your attention. I look forward to, you know, many future conversations with you to talk about that initiative and answer questions. So I think those are the things that are coming to mind for me this morning as I'm listening to others as well.
So that shift you talked about, does that require legislative approval, as far as you know?
Well, yes, it's a budgetary shift. Yes, so
Okay.
it's in the budget. So.
Okay. I should know the answer to this, but there's a lot of talk about vouchers. When you have a voucher and you don't have a house to apply it to, or a rental unit to apply it to, I guess the question is the voucher worth the entire rent, or does that put a cap on what the tenant can pay based upon their income?
So the rental assistance programs I'm referring to are sometimes called rapid rehousing, or they're really temporary rental assistance programs that are intended to bridge to a long-term housing choice voucher, right, or a Section 8, or a household exits, you know, graduates from that temporary rental assistance because they increase their income and can afford their rent. And how much that voucher covers in terms of the rent for the household depends on the program. The 2 very large COVID-related rental assistance initiatives that we have are both looking at households paying 30% of their income towards rent. So it mirrors how the Housing Choice Voucher program works. And so households pay 30% of their income towards housing costs.
So
when households have a voucher, they're tentatively approved. They go through that process, and then they continue the search for housing, and they have a certain amount of time to do that. Sometimes the voucher will expire before they do that, and they lose the voucher. But we haven't expired any vouchers. We're still helping people seek housing, and so the goal would be that they have that voucher. They know they have it when they're looking for housing.
I guess I'm trying to get at the question, just using your classic Section 8 voucher, even pre-COVID. You would take that voucher, find an apartment, and that would entitle the tenant to have rent be limited to 30% of their income, correct?
Essentially, yes.
Okay. With the new program that we established through the VSHA to pay back rent for people, did that cover that 30% for those people?
Yes, but I need to defer to my colleagues at State Housing Authority who can probably answer more specifically on that.
Well, it might be a good time to go to Jean. I would think she could answer that. But I'm just curious of whether we have a lot of people out there who are not on Section 8, who by virtue of our rent stabilization program from the CARES Fund, were paying no rent. my understanding. And yet, is it possible that low-income people who had Section 8 vouchers were still required to pay rent?
Michael, Sean, I think, had his hand up with an answer.
Okay.
Sure, and I'm sure Jean could answer this as well, but Sean Gilpin from the Department of Housing and Community Development. The Rental Housing Stabilization Program did cover rental obligations for people with Section 8 vouchers. So the difference between, or that 30% of their income that they were required to pay despite having a voucher. And it should also be noted the voucher, housing choice voucher, limits the amount of payment that a particular renter pays to between 30 and actually 40% of the rent, depending on some situations. But it also caps the amount of rent that's allowed. So one can only rent an apartment that's being rented at the fair market rates that HUD dictates every year, with some allowances for utility payments. But in short, the Rental Housing Stabilization Program covered tenant obligations that were holding housing choice vouchers.
So I guess this is a follow-up question for the congressional delegation. Is there anything in the new legislation or pending that disqualifies people who have vouchers from getting rent payments through that money?
I'd have to look more, this is Polly in Senator Leahy's office, I'd have to look more closely at the legislation. I think there is language in there about not supplanting other federal housing funds, but we'll have to do more research on that.
And that is, if I may, that's actually one of the clarifying questions that we sent to the U.S. Treasury Department as well. There's language in there about individuals who receive federal assistance, and it's unclear whether a housing choice voucher would be considered federal assistance that would disqualify them from the emergency rental assistance funds. So that's something we're seeking clarity on.
We may want to, I mean, I don't, if we're concerned about clawback and things like that, we may want to also ask the question, if we're giving renter rebate checks to people in the state of Vermont, could that possibly disqualify somebody from help?
And actually, the Rental Housing Stabilization Program, we worked with tax, and they currently have instructions on the rental rebate program that funds received by the landlord from the Rental Housing Stabilization Program should not be included on line 3 of the LC 142, which is the landlord certificate that dictates what the rental rebate amount is eligible. So in other words, without the jargon, payments received from the Rental Housing Stabilization Program are not eligible for the renter rebate.
Okay. Okay, thank you very much. We'll go to Jean. Do you have some comments? And then we'll go to Angela and we'll finish up.
Yes, thank you very much. I thank the committee for being very interested in how this is all going to work. I'm Jean Murray. I'm from Vermont Legal Aid. I think the question is, can we think creatively about how ERA can be used even in its current form to do things that we really need to have happen here in Vermont? And there is a part of the ERA that says other expenses related to housing. And I hope that that can be interpreted to allow people who are currently housed in our housing stock for their landlords to make repairs. I mean, one of the things that we see at Legal Aid all the time is that lots and lots of tenants are living in places that are substandard, and that there are repairs needed to the places that people are living. And so it would be good to make sure that our housing stock gets improved, even for the folks who are already living in it. Another thing, when I think about what I want the money to be used for, it says it's supposed to go to tenant households, to help them. And I think the people who already have evictions filed against them, we need to be able to have the money like we did with the last program available for the tenant household to negotiate an end to a current eviction case. Those are the people who are about to become homeless. And so using the funds, the rental assistance to tenant households, we need to be able to use that to end eviction cases. And when I think about people experiencing homelessness, yes, the biggest barrier is there's not units to move into, but there are other barriers. People experiencing homelessness have been housing insecure for a while. They may have other debts. They may have bad credit. They may have a need for expungement. They may have need for ongoing case management, or at least a guarantee of some case management for the foreseeable future. And so I hope that the ERA money can be used under the part that's not defined very well about housing stability services to help those people who are experiencing homelessness get the help they need, perhaps, bankruptcies or expungements or things like that, that would make them more viable tenants when they can find some housing. The other thing that I'm really worried about is that people who are on the lower income levels, and maybe this is just a generalized anxiety as opposed to an idea, people who are at lower income levels who have been housing insecure for a while, those are the people that have the hardest time getting their documents together so that they can prove that they're eligible for the programs. And so we need to be able to figure out a system that's broader than the last time. I mean, when people could self-certify about any number of things, and of course, if they could self-certify about income and they could self-certify about their hardship and things like that, that would be the best solution. But short of being able to self-certify, if there are verification documents needed, we're all working remotely, we're all at home. This is an incredible problem for low-income people who don't necessarily have internet connectivity, who don't necessarily have devices. And even if they do have devices, they don't have any way to reproduce a document and send it via the internet. So we need to have some of the ERA money, either under Housing Stability Services or administration, have staff to help people who are the lowest income get their documents together.
So a question on that, it's a very good point, but there were dual beneficiaries in terms of the past back rent program. The landlord and the tenant both were helped, and I assume the landlord's a little bit more, in most cases, maybe somewhat more sophisticated than the tenant in terms of computer skills and financial skills and et cetera. Did you see in your experience that landlords were stepping up? And I know Michael Monty is a landlord in these cases and applied for some of this stuff. He comes from a little different perspective, but I assume if he had a tenant that qualified, he did his darndest to make sure they applied. I wonder what you saw out there.
That question is better answered by Vermont State Housing Authority, but we all did. Our group knew that housing providers and subsidized housing providers really did reach out to their tenants and put together a list every month. The last program, if people recall, would you could apply over and over again for the rent arrears that you owed. So in other words, rent would have to be in arrears in order to be eligible for the program. So people would catch up with their rent arrears, and then the next month they'd apply in the next. So housing providers such as Champlain Housing Trust was really good at working with their tenants and doing applications. And certainly many landlords were very good with reaching out to their tenants and helping. But if Angela gets a chance to talk, she'll also say that not having technical ability to do things is not just limited to tenants. Some landlords aren't. And if you look at who landlords are in Vermont, there's a significant percentage of them that are really small landlords that only rent 1 or 2 units and may not have all sorts of technical sophistication available to them.
Senator Sorokin, if I could say, our property managers were knocking on doors to help tenants to make sure that they got their stuff in. But let me just say that I think the notion of self-certification, no matter what program you're in, the ability to certify within a program that you're in. So if you are getting a voucher, if you're with a nonprofit affordable housing organization, if you are getting support through any other program, that should be enough to be able to sort of say, yep, this person qualifies, and then we can move them through the system probably a little faster, because everybody, all the nonprofits and all the state organizations are constantly certifying income.
Right.
It isn't like there's a lack of that. There's plenty of that going on. So I think the question then becomes, is there certain people who are not in the system, and how we could work through that? But if we could extend the certification to other agencies, the ability to do that, that may be a way of getting to Jean's notion. And I'm not, I'm outside my circle
Right
here, but
that's a good segue to Angela, because she maybe represent people who are not nonprofits or public housing organizations, and she could talk a little bit about the application process and what we can do differently, perhaps, or what we need to look out for as we move forward into the new monies. Welcome, Angela.
Thank you, Senator Sorokin. Thank you, everybody, for this opportunity. I will echo what my colleagues have said about avenues for this money for programs and the need to stand up a new program as quickly as possible. Vermont State Housing Authority stopped taking applications on December 11th. And so that means there has been no rental assistance available after that time. And we are still waiting for an allocation to cover all of the applications that came in on the prior program. So the longer that there is a delay in our ability to stand up a new program, the greater the hardship it is for both the landlord and the tenant. And this is part of the reason why the ask has been made for even just a portion of these funds. Richard Williams referred to a $50 million request to allow a new program to get up off the ground. We do have a lot of challenges, I think, in terms of the type of documents and certifications that are going to be required for this new program. We saw challenges on the landlord side. Technology and access to technology is not something that is unique to the tenant population. There were also many landlords who do not have access to computers, scanners, had to mail in their paperwork to Vermont State Housing Authority. So we need some sort of avenue or way for everybody to have this. Normally what we would tell folks is you can go to your public library, you can use the computers and the systems there. That is not available currently for many people with the COVID situation. So the normal avenue to get access to that technology is not available. I think the other challenge that we are going to have is this new program requires a landlord and a tenant certification or application, and then a standalone tenant application if the landlord's not willing to participate. But there's not one for the converse. So as a part of the Vermont program under CRF, we had a mechanism for the landlord to apply on their own if the tenant wasn't participating or wasn't able, or in some circumstances, if the landlord had other reasons, they received less funding under that aspect of the program, but there was a mechanism there for them to access the funds. With the information that Richard Williams has provided, it seems as though a majority of those landlords applying into that section of the program was because they could not get tenant participation for the documents that the tenant was required to produce. So that, I think, is a gap in this new fund or this new program. If there's a way to address that with regulations or guidance, that would be helpful, because you have a landlord that's walking paperwork over to a tenant's door, knocking on their door, has already filled out the paperwork, asking them for a signature, and they still can't get that. And this is to benefit the tenant for this rental payment, to keep their arrearage from piling up, to keep them housed. So we would ask for some sort of mechanism along those lines that is going to allow landlords to access this money as well if the tenant is not participating. I will echo about the mobile home park assistance and the rehab program. I think being able to use funds to rehabilitate units, get new units online that currently aren't in compliance, do repairs to existing units that need work are a benefit to everybody here. It creates safer housing, it creates housing stability, and if that gets packaged with some energy efficiency work, it's sort of a win across the board for everybody. One final plug, one of the things that hasn't been mentioned is we did have a mediation program that we were offering as a way for landlords and tenants to have a professional mediator paid for. This has really been important with our eviction moratorium, again, to continue that housing stability approach where we're offering resources for folks to work out their differences and see if they can't reestablish the relationship so it will continue forward even beyond our normal eviction moratorium.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you, Angela. I'm going to be very brief, and we have other witnesses coming in right now on homelessness. I want to thank everybody. Stay tuned. We're going to be in touch with all of you as we move forward. The legislature, I hope, will not take a wait and see or a back seat in these discussions. We want to be an integral part of the discussion in coming up with ideas to maximize affordable housing and maximize this opportunity. Specific thanks to our congressional delegation for giving us this challenge to deal with, but it's a good challenge to have. So thank you all for participating, and we will be back in touch. Appreciate it. Bye-bye. Those on homelessness, I'm going to turn it over to Erhard right away and let him guide this discussion in terms of his witnesses he would like to have speak to us. Erhard,
thank you,
go ahead.
Thank you, Senator Sirotkin. Can you hear me?
I can.
Well, thank you, Senator and committee members. I believe we have Kara Casey. I can't see if Kara's in the room. I apologize. I'm also monitoring the House committee hearings, which were co-scheduled with the roundtable. Kara should be up first, and I just wanted to ask if it's possible. There was someone who had been inadvertently left off of one of my witness lists, and if you may have a little bit of additional time for maybe 2 minutes of testimony from Stephen Marshall, who's a Chittenden County, longtime Chittenden County homeless advocate.
I got your email on that, and I thought I responded yes. So we're all set.
Fantastic. If maybe we could slot Stephen in right after Emily before Sue Minter and Eileen Peltier. That would be great. I will connect Stephen with the Zoom link that I got from Nathan. And thanks again for your time.
Thank you. Kara, welcome.
Hello.
Hi.
Hi. Thank you so much for inviting me here today. My name is Kara Casey, and I work for the Vermont Network Against Domestic and Sexual Violence. I do housing and economic justice work there. And I'm also the new co-chair of the Vermont Coalition to End Homelessness. So thank you for the opportunity to speak today. And I want to start off by thanking you for your hard work on allocating federal funding last year to the programs and organizations that have been able to safely shelter and house those without housing and create new housing stock and prevent homelessness. So just for a little background on the network and the Coalition to End Homelessness, the Vermont Network is Vermont's federally recognized domestic and sexual violence coalition. We represent 15 independent nonprofit member organizations which provide advocacy and support to victims of domestic and sexual violence. We also have several other programs that are underneath the Vermont Network. and one is the DIVAS program that works within the Chittenden Regional Correctional Facility that's been around for about 20 years. We also platform the Deaf Vermonters Advocacy Services and the statewide Sexual Nurse Examiners Program. The Vermont Coalition to End Homelessness is the planning and governing body for the HUD recognized balance of state continuum of care, which applies for and receives millions of dollars of funding annually in competitive HUD homelessness funding. We support the work of local continuums of care, connect them to a broader network of stakeholders, administer federal funds, and advocate for funding and policy changes so that people living in Vermont have safe, stable, and affordable homes. And if homelessness does occur, it's brief and rare occurrence during which everyone is treated with dignity and respect. So now I'll just talk to you a little bit about the impact of the pandemic on homelessness. And I understand you just had a housing roundtable, so I'm sure that you heard about that in different perspectives. But we have, Earhart has created a fact sheet and provided some other background materials for you all to take a look at on your committee's site. So at the beginning of the pandemic, our system of care was really tested. With the high risk of spreading COVID for those housed in congregate settings in the state, service providers, the state, and the greater community responded quickly to move households experiencing homelessness into motels. The response looked slightly different in every community. Households were connected to food, resources, and support. And this system was not without its challenges, but was extremely successful in its goal of limiting the spread of the virus among the population and ensuring that people have a place to shelter at home, even if they don't have a permanent home. So as of the first week in January, there were over 2,500 people in motels through the General Assistance Program. 386 of them were children. There were another 12 households in motels through the domestic and sexual violence programs. So there are a number of our programs that actually get funding through the General Assistance Program, and they pay motels directly to house survivors as kind of an overflow for their shelters. And then there were approximately 350 households in shelter and emergency apartments. So that's compared to a little over 1,100 people that were identified in 2020's point in time count. So that's last January. And I will point out that tonight is actually the point in time count this year. And although we're pretty confident that most people are sheltered, we're not counting on sheltered folks this year due to safety issues, but I think that will be a real reflection of the change from one year to another. And it's been a really remarkable effort on the part of communities to be able to figure out a way to get all of those folks counted this year. But the response hasn't just been about getting Vermonters temporarily housed. It has gone further in connecting to and investing in longer term housing solutions. So there's been a monumental effort in communities to get households onto their local coordinated entry lists, where they can be connected with services and prioritized for housing. Programs such as the CRF-funded Rapid Resolution Housing Initiative through the Department for Children and Families have assisted households in moving out of motels. The Vermont Network received these rapid resolution funds and were able to spend over $70,000 to assist 33 households that were experiencing homelessness. The flexibility of these funds was really key and something that providers need more of. We were able to not only provide security deposit and rental assistance, but also things like transportation to a safer location. We had one survivor who was moving out of state to live with family, and things like essential furniture to move into their own place. Just really being able to allow survivors to access housing that works best for them. About 50% of those that we supported just needed help getting back on their feet, and then were able to pay market rate rent on their own or move in with family. and the other households were able to secure subsidies. The 12 to 18-month rental subsidies that were created during this time put a much needed infusion of assistance into our system of care. As of early January, with the Vermont rental subsidy, 52 families were able to secure vouchers and 40 were leased up. And through the CARES housing project that was created, 275 households received vouchers and 91 had been leased up. So with this increase in subsidy, we're seeing, as with before the pandemic, a significant challenge in finding rental units. As my colleagues from one of our member organizations just spoke to in the House committees, they have been working really diligently with all community partners and local landlords, but still have folks that are subsidy in hand, services attached, and not able to find a physical unit to move into.
Can I ask a question?
Yes.
Is it just a supply issue, or is there some discrimination going on at all that you see out there?
I think that it's definitely a supply issue in terms of not enough housing, in terms of the housing being outside of the fair market rent standard. And then also, I mean, with such a tight housing market, we are seeing that, it's, why rent to somebody with some like really complex challenges and poor rental history when you could kind of have the pick of people to choose from. So I just heard from our Divas program that's helping women moving out of the correctional facility, and just it's really hard to be able to find a landlord that's going to rent to someone with a criminal background. So I think it's a multitude of things, but they're all kind of compounded.
Is there any way that you can think of that? I'm sure part of the problem is the fair market rents out there that qualify for vouchers, and the rents being sky high. So a lot of the rents are above the level, and therefore they're not accessible to people with vouchers.
Mm-hmm.
With all this money we have coming in, is there any way that we can get around that problem from the landlord's perspective so that they could open their property up?
I'm not exactly sure. Like, I don't know if thinking about something like, being able to pay the other percentage of the rent that's kind of over. With some programs, I'm not sure that is eligible. But I do know that in some communities, they have actually paid for a new kind of survey and been able to say to HUD, like, hey, we've actually done our own survey, and what you say is kind of fair market rent in this area is actually way too low. And here's what the actual, rental market looks like. I think that the barrier to doing that is that it costs money.
Yeah, I just probably missing some key factors, but it seems like if we have a pot of money to do rehab of buildings, we have a pot of money to do weatherization of buildings, we have a pot of money to pay people's rent, a lot of those things are going to help landlords immeasurably. Why can't we ask something of the landlord in terms of opening up more units to low-income folks? So something
Yeah.
to think about.
Yeah, I definitely think that a lot of the projects that Vhcb has done in collaboration with communities have had certain standards, that those units need to meet in terms of meeting fair market rent. So, that's something that I think our housing partners are skilled at doing, at creating that housing that does meet that fair market rent, and also has, units set aside for folks that are experiencing homelessness.
I mean, it's another way of saying, when we do all our economic development programs, we give money out to corporations and things like that. We ask something in return, that they provide good paying jobs or higher wages than they might otherwise pay. So this is sort of, we're putting an infusion of money into housing. Anyhow, enough said about that. We're going to have to start moving on. We have about 4 more witnesses and we only have like 15 minutes. Senator Clarkson.
Yeah, I mean, it was a question I had with our last group of our roundtable, which is we didn't really talk about supportive services. And I think landlords would be it just strikes me that if we could partner, I mean, most of these people moving out of homelessness into housing have a support service somewhere attached to them. And if we could guarantee that with every person moving out of homelessness into a housing unit, I would hope that landlords would be much more open to enabling this transition into permanent housing for people. And I don't know how much that's discussed as an asset. That's a huge asset for both the landlord and for the incoming tenant to have that support service working with them to hopefully ensure the success of this transition.
Yeah, I think that certainly helps a landlord to know, like, hey, this person has had challenges in the past, but they actually have somebody there supporting them. And there's also been an investment in landlord liaisons, which are folks that are really that are working at those same organizations, but they are actually the person that reaches out to the landlords and supports the landlords as well.
Right.
So I think that's a great model too.
I have one question, if I can, and then maybe we can move on to other witnesses. You're not associated with a direct provider like a CAP agency or OEO. You're a freestanding advocacy group, correct?
The Coalition End Homelessness or the Vermont Network. Sorry.
The Vermont Network, I guess.
We're a freestanding.
And the coalition as well. I guess do you have an opinion on this pending transition to local agencies of the motel program?
We don't have an official opinion. What I will tell you is that our members, because we have 15 member organizations, that our member organizations, some of them were actually the first to transition from the ESD holding the money to actually the member organizations holding the money. So many of our domestic violence and sexual violence organizations actually get funding from GA to house people in motels. So they kind of cut out that middleman. And I think the key that those folks will tell you is that there really needs to also be an investment in the staff time and the administrative time to be able to do that work.
Okay. Anything else? Kara would like to move on to other witnesses, if I could.
Yeah, well, I just thank you so much for all your work and the continued investment in those 3 legs of the stool: services, subsidy, and housing infrastructure. And I just wanted to also urge you to support the governor's recommendation to use 20 million in one-time funds and 34.8 million overall to Vhcb to help to address some of those critical needs that we were talking about. Thank you.
Thank you. Is there an order? I see we have 3 or maybe more if we include Sue of witnesses. Do you guys have an order that you prefer to go?
Senator, if I could interrupt quickly, yes. Emily was next, I believe, and then Stephen and Sue and Eileen.
Okay.
Sorry.
Emily, welcome.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. My name is Emily Taylor, and I'm currently a service coordinator at Champlain Housing Trust out of Burlington. Thank you for your time today and for the opportunity to testify to the amazing work that Champlain Housing Trust and agencies all around the state have been doing. This is actually my 3rd year attending Vermont Homelessness Awareness Day, but my 1st year testifying. The previous 2 years I attended as a housing advocate when I worked for Chittenden Community Action. I started with Champlain Housing Trust in March of last year, just 2 weeks before Governor Scott issued the Stay Home, Stay Safe order. And immediately after, Champlain Housing Trust worked with the state of Vermont and community partners to transform the Harbor Place Hotel in Shelburne into a COVID-19 isolation and recovery housing site for those who did not have a home to stay safe in, and for those who would struggle to isolate at home due to living with immunocompromised persons. My role very quickly shifted into providing short-term service coordination for guests staying in the COVID-19 motel to help them connect with coordinated entry, to apply for 3 squares, and begin working on a temporary housing plan for after their quarantine period ended. We served 102 households through the end of September at Harbor Place. And then in October, CARES Act funding allowed us to purchase the Ho-Hum Motel in South Burlington for this purpose, which is still operational today. To date, we have served 169 households at the Ho-Hum. So that's 271 unduplicated households served between the 2 COVID sites in 10 months. Harbor Place has since reverted to its original model, a motel serving GA emergency housing guests. In addition to purchasing the Ho-Hum, Champlain Housing Trust also purchased Handy's extended stay suites in Colchester with coronavirus relief funds made available through the CARES Act. This hotel converted into office and shelter space for up to 21 households for Steps to End Domestic Violence, who as of last month have fully moved in. Steps reported a 50% increase in domestic violence cases due to the pandemic. And finally, yet importantly, Champlain Housing Trust also purchased the Baymont Inn in Essex Junction with CARES Act funding to convert the building into 68 permanent apartments. The building was renamed Susan's Place, aptly named after Susan Ainsworth Daniels. Susan was a longtime social worker at Champlain Housing Trust for over 25 years and began the development of our resident services department until her passing last March. All of these projects, but Susan's Place especially, have been a major demonstration of the extraordinary partnership Champlain Housing Trust maintains with the Chittenden Continuum of Care and Coordinated Entry System. I'm sure that you've been hearing about these partnerships from all around the state today. All 68 households who moved into Susan's Place moved in from literal homelessness, and through vouchers made available from both the Burlington and Vermont state housing authorities, as well as many Vermont rental subsidy vouchers and CARES support from the state of Vermont, we were able to ensure affordable housing to some of the most vulnerable Vermonters in our community. I'm now the site-based service coordinator for Susan's Place, and I'm offering support to all 68 households here. I'm actually still in the process of moving into my office out here. And I'm now offering support to a gentleman, John, who experienced chronic homelessness before moving into Susan's Place. He was housed in Vermont over 5 years ago, but was evicted after his apartment sustained significant property damage inflicted by guests that he was frequently inviting over. And unfortunately, in this case, they were not coming over for dinner and charades, but because they knew that they had a place in the community where they could go to abuse heroin and substances alike. John grew up in an extremely abusive household, and over time he thought that he learned that saying yes to other people and letting people do what they wanted to do was how to build lasting relationships and make other people happy. But not long after meeting these people did he become addicted himself. Suddenly paying rent, keeping the utilities on, and respecting his neighbors weren't much of a priority. John declined services from agencies who reached out wanting to help him. And ultimately, it wasn't until he was evicted that he understood the gravity of the lifestyle he had been living, though today he would tell you that he wasn't really living for himself. The last 5 years were a constant uphill battle for him to meet his basic needs every day and work towards stable housing again. He entered into a lengthy rehabilitation program and still goes to the Chittenden Clinic to maintain his sobriety. He had very large debts to pay to his previous landlord and housing subsidy provider, which is a barrier to housing that we see in many cases. But thankfully for John, he was able to finish those payments last year due to the Rapid Resolution Housing Initiative Fund, which was made available from the CARES Act as well. Over time, he began saying no to toxic people in his life and has maintained connections with his support team, which now includes me. And every few days here at Susan's place, I'll see him come into the lobby and just sit so he can say hi to his neighbors who are coming home. Susan's place has been a really bittersweet project for me personally. I couldn't be happier to see so many people in permanent housing, but yet it's heartbreaking to know that they couldn't access affordable permanent housing until Susan's place opened in November, which was almost a full 8 months since I last worked with some of them as their housing advocate. Helping these 68 households find housing in just 2 or 3 months is really certainly something to celebrate, and we have celebrated, but there is still so much work to be done for the hundreds, if not thousands, of other Vermonters that are still experiencing homelessness and temporarily living in hotels all across the state. I couldn't help notice yesterday that Governor Scott proposed a one-time appropriation for affordable housing development on top of the normal allocation. So as I conclude my testimony for you today, I will just leave you with this, that Champlain Housing Trust is absolutely ready to create or build more affordable housing just as soon as we can. Thank you again for your time.
Thank you. Any questions? Okay, I'm going to move on to Steve Marshall.
Yes, thank you for the opportunity to speak today. My name is Stephen Marshall. I've been an advocate and an activist for the homeless community here in Burlington for at least 5 years. And in that time, I've mostly circulated with the folks who are living outdoors. So I rise to speak for them. I'm really grateful for and admire the testimony that has come today, House testimony and Senate testimony about housing, about services to homeless folks. But the group that is unspoken for, who I stand to speak for, are those who lose their permission to live anywhere. When you lose your housing, you move to a car, you move to a tent, you might move into an ATM. There are the situations when you lose your housing can be very desperate. And what I'm here to ask you to do is to consider a plan that I call safe parking, safe camping. Most folks in this phase, they don't have permission to live anywhere. So the proposal is to require towns to have a plan so that when someone loses their housing, there's a plan to help them do something. One story that I heard was from a guy who was sleeping in his car, and the cop would come and knock on the window and say, "You can't sleep here." So if you're homeless and you're living in your car, you're constantly being shuttled along. I lived in my vehicle for a long time. It was really hard to find someplace I could safely park. So the idea is to bring everyone who is between housing within the law by having a law that helps them find a way to be safe. That proposal is on the VECH, is it VHC or VECH? Now I'm forgetting the Google Drive, the folder, and I probably could find it. But anyway, it's in the folder with the other documents prepared for today, and it's called Safe Camping, Safe Parking, and I hope you'll take a look at it. It's probably for somebody in the legislative committee a little immature, but I think you'll see that I've covered a lot of the details. Thank you very much for the chance to speak.
Thank you, Stephen. Sue, would you like to talk to us?
I do. Can you hear me okay?
You're loud and clear.
Okay. Thank you so much for having us here today. I'm here. I think you met me last week, and you know that I'm the executive director of Capstone Community Action, the anti-poverty organization in Washington, Lamoille, and Orange counties, and part of a network of community action agencies around the state. But today I am here really as a member of the Washington County Homeless Response Team, which really the state brought together in the immediate onset of COVID, but has become an ongoing task force, meeting and working collectively ever since. And we've really worked as a collective force ever since the first days of the shutdown. And we have together stood up critical supports for our homeless neighbors in our county. And I am really pleased to really be testifying together with Downstreet's tremendous asset director, Eileen Peltier, who has also worked with me as what we call the Unified Commanders. Really early on, we set up the Washington County Incident Command Center. And she also continues, and we meet weekly, and she's really a key leader of our task force. So we will be submitting written testimony and just speak briefly today, sharing our insights, our experience, the data, and how we've worked through this crisis, but also where we go from here. I want to just thank you all so much for taking the time, like you are today, to really reflect and listen and advocate for solutions for homelessness and housing insecurity. We know that being homeless is deeply traumatic. It's stigmatizing and can really result in long-term negative impacts on people's physical, mental, and financial health. And just want to say thank you for taking on this responsibility forward today and throughout your session. We just came from the House and heard quite an extensive testimony from around the state. And really the point is that every region of our state has responded to the pandemic in different ways. But what's so critical to understand is we have all been stepping up really tirelessly to meet extraordinary and unfolding demands of our time. And I want to emphasize that we've worked very closely with our state agencies, and I want to shout out and commend tremendous dedication and work from the Agency of Human Services, particularly DCF, Children's and Families, the Office of Economic Opportunity, as well as the Departments of Health and Mental Health, and also the Emergency Operations Center. All of these agencies and entities have been dedicated partners. And we feel thrilled, especially by the state's proactive agreement to actually place homeless neighbors into hotels. It's a huge leap. They eventually took over the feeding of the hotel guests that many organizations like Capstone were doing actually for 5 months. And they have also been very much supporting the team with resources. So housing counseling, helping moving people out of housing insecurity, mental health, medical supports, safety and security at the hotels, which has become quite acute. But I also want to recognize the key programs that you have funded through CARES Act. These have been essential, from the housing subsidy vouchers you were talking about, the rental assistance and rental rehab for our landlords. We have a rapid resolution funding, which is really essential because it's flexible in how it's used and the eligibility for these funds. And all of these collective resources have made really the difference in our community. And we are hugely optimistic and hopeful that these resources will continue to be available at least for 6 months, but we believe we need them much longer. I want to ask Nathan if he can put a slide up. We have prepared an impact report, which really tries to lay out what we've done, but also to emphasize that while we've done a tremendous amount, we continue to face dire numbers that you will see here. I want to say at the outset that the bottom really shows you, I think, if you can see the whole thing, the point is that a home is part of the solution, but it's not the whole solution. And as you look at all of the services, and we lay them out in the second page of this report, I encourage you to really see the numbers of things we've done. It really shows you how much it takes to serve this community. Up the upper left here, you will see the graph that really looks at the numbers and the change, the dramatic escalation of the numbers of people in our hotel based on our coordinated entry report. Before, in early March, we had in Washington County 128 households, now 324 households, 153% increase. That represents 396 adults and 91 children. So many children that are homeless, and we serve many of them through our Head Start program. On the positive side, we've actually managed to house permanently 65 of these households. That's a huge accomplishment, but not nearly enough. And just as critical, we've created 67 new units. Incredible advance, but again, not meeting the need. Paralleling this, we have our wonderful shelter. And I do want to recognize at the bottom of the slide there, you'll see all of the members of our task force. You're almost there, one little bit further down, can you see? Which includes Another Way. It includes the Agency of Human Services, the Good Samaritan Haven, the Parent-Child Center of Washington County, and it includes our Good Samaritan Haven and the Washington County Mental Health Services. So all of us work together. Our shelter, before the pandemic, we had 76 bed capacity. Now we have 25 bed capacity. So this 51 bed decrease is not going to simply come back after COVID. And on top of that, these are only shelter beds for individuals, no families. And we already heard 91 children. So we have a tremendous challenge. I think that these numbers can feel overwhelming, but we really feel that also this year has taught us that we're stronger than we think, we're more capable than we believe, and we are even more resilient than we ever imagined. But I feel it is so important to remember that we can do amazing things, and we have to use this crisis as a transformational time to go forward and not back to where we had been. So with that, I'm going to hand the screen to Eileen to give you more of where we go from here. Thank you, Nathan.
Thank you, Sue. Eileen, welcome.
Thank you. Good morning, Nathan. You can take the slide down now if you'd like. Thank you. I'm Eileen Peltier, Executive Director of Downstreet Housing and Community Development. Thank you for the opportunity to speak today on Homeless Awareness Day. My role today is to share some specifics about what we, the Washington County Homeless Task Force, together believe is needed. Sorry, I usually do the verbose inspirational speech, but not today. Today, we need action. So here we go. First, I will touch on the three-legged stool of housing supply, subsidy, and case management. Supply in Washington County is tenuous and totally inadequate. I don't overuse the word crisis, especially these days, but I do think it is time to think of our housing supply challenge as a crisis. Capital funding is critical. For our region, we can immediately use capital funding to support development like our upcoming project in Berlin that will serve 30 families, as well as the many pipeline projects waiting to queue up for funding. We can use capital to bring more offline privately owned rentals back online, which would mean a continuation of the rental rehab program that was so successful in the past year. We believe there is a strong potential to successfully house individuals in a single room occupancy peer-based model. Washington County Mental Health Services has leased 4 buildings and is currently housing a total of 14 individuals with great success. We would use capital to expand on this model. Yesterday's news that the governor's budget includes an overall $34.8 million to Vermont Housing and Conservation Board is very welcome. We hope you all will support the governor's recommendation, which will truly begin to address the housing supply crisis. The second leg of the stool is subsidy. We need more, and we need it to be committed to projects early. Housing supply and subsidy are codependent. With the Biden administration signaling they will be increasing voucher availability and the governor's increased capital proposal, there is some reason for hope. Case management is the final leg of the stool. To be clear, case management directly impacts housing retention, which is the household's ability to stay permanently housed. This is no small issue in Vermont. For some of our neighbors, an apartment is a temporary respite between episodes of homelessness. Permanent housing is a misnomer for too many Vermonters. Our task force is working hard to understand the many and varied ways in which we case manage our vulnerable neighbors. There are many successful programs and a strong group of providers, but we can do more. We need the flexibility to use our funds in innovative ways, and we need more funds to meet the growing need for case management. Speaking to the emergency shelter beds for individuals, as Sue said, we've lost 51 beds due to COVID restrictions. In the near term, we need to develop 40 to 50 new beds. To make this happen, we need both capital to develop the building and a commitment to ongoing operating support through the Agency of Human Services. For families, we believe expanding family supportive housing vouchers and associated programs is critical. This program combines vouchers and case management, and it works. The Family Center of Washington County has increased case management in the hotels, but more is needed both immediately and as part of a long-term solution for families. If we can address the supply issue, putting families directly into permanent housing through the Family Supportive Housing Program is a far better option than hotel stays. With funds, we can do more for the 91 children in our hotels today. To ensure we coordinate effectively and efficiently, we need financial support to invest in the development of a virtual hub for homeless services in central Vermont. Our task force has built a sense of purpose and partnership, and we would embrace the opportunity to develop a virtual hub that provides cohesive, coordinated programs for people experiencing homeless across Washington County. We are committed to our partnership and strongly believe we can have a greater impact if we can get capacity support to move our vision along. Many of these requests can have an immediate impact. Others will take time we may not have. At this point, we understand that the hotel system, including the enhanced case management, will end sometime in 2021. We want to say clearly that we believe this would create not only a short-term disaster, but would critically reduce the long-term success of the programs I've just highlighted. Continuing to invest in the hotels while simultaneously funding the innovative solutions identified is the only humane option. This is not to suggest that we don't have problems at the hotels with so many people congregating, but we are working on that through a joint approach of security and supports with other community partners. Certainly, it is a costly solution, but we have the opportunity in this moment to permanently reinvent our system so that the likelihood of homelessness will be greatly reduced and the quality of life for our neighbors will be greatly improved. Before I close, I do want to speak briefly to the AHS's proposal to transfer the GA, the General Assistance Hotel Funds, to each county. Although we understand there is much more to discuss about this proposed program, we want to say at this time, our task force has very serious concerns and we do not support the proposal. We will be pleased to testify more specifically on this in the future. In closing, I want to thank the committee for your time today, your dedication to helping our most vulnerable Vermonters, and your support over many years. We certainly can say these are challenging times. They are. But for too many Vermonters, every day is a struggle that begins and ends with a worry about whether or not they will be able to rest with a roof over their head and a warm bed. Too often, we stigmatize individuals and families experiencing homelessness. We believe that focusing on housing our neighbors as a systemic challenge is a moral imperative for Vermont. Moving the conversation from homeless to unhoused neighbors speaks to the need to address the system as a whole. With that, we stand ready to continue our work and to do more and more and more. Thank you.
Thanks, Eileen. It's about noon and the vigil is about to get started. Committee members, if you want to join that, you can do it on YouTube or you can connect with Nathan or Earhart and they could let you into the room. I want to thank everybody. It's been a long morning and great presentations and incredible amount to think about. So I bid you adieu until I guess this afternoon at 1.